Welcome to another Pure Read audiobook. It's wonderful to have you with us. Before we get started, please like and subscribe to our channel and share it with friends. Supporting us in this simple and easy way ensures we can continue adding more delightful audiobooks for your listening enjoyment. The following story is copyrighted Pure Read Limited, the home of books you can trust. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy. Jedidiah and Abby, Western Historical Romance by Emma Morgan. Chapter 1. The gentle breeze ruffled Jedidiah Rusher's thick black hair as he guided his wagon down the dusty road. He watched the sky, measuring the clouds in the blueness, hoping that another windstorm wouldn't come along anytime soon. He had to get into Woodland for nails and other supplies in order to repair the damage that had already been done, and it was going to be enough work, as it was. Even with 6 brothers, there was always plenty of work. Fortunately, the puffy clouds seemed to promise fair weather to come, which would be helpful while he climbed on top of the roof, nailed down shingles that threatened to break free, and repaired the trim around the windows. Eventually, he would get around to fixing the damage that had been done to the barn as well. As he entered the city limits, Jed could see that the town was bustling. Folks hurried back and forth across the street as they bought supplies, stopped in at the local restaurant for a bite to eat, or headed for the blacksmith's shop. Despite the rush, they always raised a hand or called out a hail to those they knew. This was what had attracted Jed to the area in the first place when he had arrived in Northern California 5 years ago. He waved to the clerk from the post office, several neighbors, and a big man with flaming hair by the name of Deputy Gaines. At the general store, he had to wait in line. The Reason twins had damaged properties besides his own, and plenty of other customers were there for supplies. "You can't tell me that's a fair price for nails," exclaimed the patron in front of the counter. He was a bulky man with pale blonde hair, and a brilliant shade of red was creeping from the back of his neck up to his scalp. Even without seeing his face, Jed instantly recognized him as Harvey Kirkman, who had arrived in Woodland about a year ago and had been making trouble ever since. The clerk, a frail man in his 50s, by the name of Monroe, who was always kind to everyone, clenched a fist impatiently and shook his head. "Now, Harvey, how many times must we go over this? You've been shopping in this store for quite some time now, and you should know that the prices are what they are." Jed had only ever heard Monroe take this sharp tone with small children who didn't keep their hands to themselves. "Oh, really?" Harvey challenged. "You're going to tell me that you don't gouge us for a few pounds of nails just because we're way out here in California? I know how you types work. You think that just because the goods take a little longer to get here, you can get twice as much money for them. Well, you can just keep your nails and everything else I was going to buy too. I won't bring my business back here ever again." Harvey swiveled on his heel and marched out the door, his fists swinging at his sides and his face beet red. "See you next week, Harvey," Monroe called after him. He shook his head again and smiled as Jed stepped up to the counter. "I'm sorry you had to listen to all that, Jed. You know how he is." Jed turned and watched as Harvey stormed across the street, hoping he wasn't heading for the saloon again. "Unfortunately, I do, but I'm glad he didn't want to buy any nails, because I'm in the market for them. I thought I might lose my roof completely the other night." Monroe nodded wisely as he weighed the nails and put them in a burlap sack. "You and me, both. I heard that old Mrs. Henson lost an entire side of her barn. The cows got out and wandered clean into tomorrow, but a few of the local boys managed to round them up. She was mighty lucky in that sense, but her barn is still missing a wall." Running one hand through his dark curls, Jed couldn't help but imagine what it would be like if the same thing happened to him. "That is a shame. Let me know if she needs any help. Let me know if she needs any help raising a new barn. The boys and I would be glad to lend a hand." Monroe smiled. "You boys are always quick to help. I think her neighbors have it covered, but I'll let them know if I see any of them. Can I get you anything else?" Jed scratched his chin. He had just shaved that morning and stubble was growing back already. Self-consciously, he put his hand in his pocket instead. "I'd take a handful of shingles if you still have any in stock." The clerk hollered into the back of the store. "Carter, load Mr. Rusher up with some shingles." And, maybe a few razors as well. With his purchases made, Jed headed further into town. He knew he still needed to stop at the printers to see if there were any books that Judah hadn't read yet, and Jonathan had requested that he get him some hunting supplies, but it had been a long and hot journey. Jed turned in at the saloon instead. The interior of the business was dark, with deeply stained wood lining the walls and floor and the low ceiling composed of stamped metal. The saloon was a nice break from the brilliant light outside, and it made everyone a little more likely to open up and share their secrets when they felt so safely ensconced within its walls. A few customers were scattered at the bar, and others had settled in at tables. Jed was glad to see that Harvey was nowhere in sight. In the far back corner, a piano player was tinkling away softly on the keys. "You're kidding!" the barkeep exclaimed to one of the patrons as Jed entered. The man behind the bar had a thick handlebar mustache that stood out in contrast to his bald head and a potbelly that stretched the front of his apron. Thomas ran a friendly establishment, and he didn't put up with fighters. He claimed it made his wife nervous, but Jed had a good feeling that was simply an excuse. "James Trowbridge got married," Thomas continued. He leaned forward, his meaty hands on the well-worn wood of the bar as he questioned his customer. "Of all the fellas in Woodland, I wouldn't have thought it would be him." The customer, a man whom Jed didn't know by name, but one he had seen around town a few times, nodded enthusiastically. "But he did. I saw the whole thing myself. White dress and a new suit and everything. The preacher looked just as shocked as everyone else did." Jed strode across the floor and took a seat at the bar, interested in the exchange, but trying his best not to stare. In their small town, there were far more eligible bachelors than there were single women, and it was a challenge for any of them to settle down and get married. It was something that Jed wished he had thought of before he had brought all of his brothers to California with him, but there were few places in the West where it wasn't a problem. The gold rush brought men looking for fortune, but not their female counterparts. "But who did he marry?" Thomas asked. He straightened and grabbed a rag to wipe the bar with. "I think the last time a local gal said her vows, I had every man in town in here drowning their sorrows." The customer nodded. "I remember that. It was Sally Duncan, and she was mighty pretty, but Trowbridge went and found himself a woman from New York." At this, the few customers in the saloon turned around to stare at the man who had spoken. Even the piano player took his fingers from the keys and rotated his stool so he could hear better. The customer who was giving the news noticed, and he addressed the rest of his tale to the entire room. "It's true. He said he found an article in the newspaper about a woman looking for a husband, so he thought he'd go ahead and give it a shot. The next thing he knew, he was picking her up at the train station." Jed couldn't believe his ears. He'd been thinking here and there over the last few weeks of getting a wife. A man needed someone by his side to help run the household, and Jed didn't doubt that he could use someone to help him manage his brothers. Besides, he was tired of the pitiful efforts he and his brothers made at meals, and they needed good food to keep up with the farm work. The barkeeper worked his way down toward Jed. "What can I get you?" He smiled. Jed wasn't much of a drinker, but Thomas kept the best stock of sarsaparilla he had ever had. Just the usual and maybe a newspaper. Producing the requested items, Thomas eyed him curiously. "You aren't thinking of following in old Trowbridge's footsteps, are you? The way you and the boys live up there on the hill? I wouldn't think you'd ever want to give up your freedom." Jed took a sip of the refreshing drink and began scanning the paper. "It's a thought, Thomas. There's only so much freedom when you come home after a hard day's worth of work to a cold stove and a cold bed. It might be time for me to find my other half. Good luck to you. I have my doubts, but maybe you'll prove me wrong. Betsy and I met the traditional way, but that was before we moved out here. It's definitely not the same game when you live in gold territory." Jed continued to skim the paper. There were birth announcements, obituaries, and even a small piece about James Trowbridge's wedding. He flipped past information about the opening of a new bank and the train schedule to find the classifieds. Here there was only further sorting for Jed as he had to look past wagons for sale and missing dogs. Finally, he found the personals. He took another slug of sarsaparilla and started reading. Chapter 2. Abby. The bedding needs to be changed out now that the Wilkinsons have left, and then I could really use some help down here. The tables are filling up fast for the dinner hour. Abby shoved the letters that had just arrived in the pocket of her apron and hurried upstairs to do as she was told. Working at the inn paid well enough, but the work was endless. She was constantly running up and down the stairs as she tried to keep up. There were always rooms to be cleaned upstairs and food and drink to be served downstairs. By the end of the day, she always stumbled home with sore feet and an aching back. She entered the room at the top of the stairs that had most recently been occupied by the Wilkinsons. It was a quaint room, as all of them were at the Peaceful Peach, with floral wallpaper, ceilings that dipped and swooped to accommodate the roofline of the big building, and wide beds with fluffy comforters. The inn was a popular destination for newlywed couples as well as those who were simply passing through. Pausing for a moment in the doorway, Abby could suddenly see herself as a young bride. She and Ben had spent their honeymoon in a very similar place, and she had been so excited at every detail of the room. "Just look at this mirror, darling. Did you ever see one so clear?" she remembered saying to him. Ben had laughed, taking her into his arms and pressing his lips to her cheek, his dark mustache tickling her skin. "You amaze me. It takes only the smallest thing to interest you." Abby had blushed, suddenly aware of not only how naive she must sound, but also the fact that she and her new husband were finally together. "I'm sorry. I just don't think I've ever stayed in a place as fine as this one, and I think I'm still a little flustered from the ceremony." "Don't you dare apologize." Her new husband had pulled her fully into his arms, and she could still see his face so clearly. Ben's dark eyes had been soft as they gazed down at her lovingly, his dark hair parted in the center and slicked back. He had looked so young, so full of life. "I think it's wonderful that you can always find something to make you happy. It's one of the things I love about you. Don't go changing that. Not for anybody." Just as quickly as it had come, the image faded and Abby was once again standing at the Peaceful Peach. A familiar feeling hit her like a wave, a striking sense of sadness that washed over her and weighed her down. It closed up her throat, welled up in her eyes, and took all the strength from her muscles. Memories of her late husband always made her feel this way, no matter how hard she tried to fight it. She knew that it was time to move on, that she had to find something else to make her happy now that Ben was gone. But he had been such a wonderful man. Abby yanked back the bedding and began stripping the sheets. It had been difficult at first to keep up with all the work, but by now she could change a bed in only a few minutes. She made quick work of the dirty linens, shoving them down the chute in the hallway to be laundered later. New sheets went on just as quickly. Next came dusting the top of the dresser and sweeping the floor. The Peaceful Peach prided itself on clean rooms, and she found that it was a demand she was happy to keep up with. At the end of the day, she always enjoyed seeing that her work had been finished and that it had made a difference, even if she was tired. Once she was done, she turned for the bedroom door and paused. Nobody would know if she stayed for just a few extra minutes to read the letters that had arrived in the mail that day. When she had first advertised for a groom, it had taken a while for anyone to respond. It was long enough that she had begun to lose hope. She told herself that it had been a silly idea in the first place and that she would never find anyone else as good as Ben. Soon enough, however, the letters began trickling in. The first few were easy to reject, obviously written by rough men with rougher ways. But she still believed that one of them would be the right one. Catching a look at herself in the long mirror, her face nervous and her hand creeping toward her apron pocket, she shook her head at herself and clomped down the back stairs to the kitchen. Willow had already said she needed help, and she could read the letters later. She could have asked her boss for a little time. Willow would probably allow it if she knew what was going on. But Abby wasn't keen on letting anyone in on her secret. It had been over a year and closing on 2 since Ben's funeral, but she didn't want to tell anyone until she knew for certain that she was ready to walk down the aisle again. She wasn't sure she ever would be. The scents of roast beef, buttered potatoes, and green beans cooked in bacon fat curled around her as she entered the kitchen and began loading down plates. Pots and pans clanked loudly, and the scullery girl struggled to keep up with the dirty dishes. For the locals, the Peaceful Peach was well known for its delicious homemade meals. Many a bachelor would find their way in for a hot meal, and on the weekends there were quite a few families that came as well. Willow had hired one of the best bakers in the county to round out her own cooking with flaky biscuits, soft cookies, and crusty bread. "I've got the front tables," Willow said over the din of the kitchen operations. "But if you could serve the back tables while I go around and check drinks, then I think we'll have it covered." The innkeeper's name suited her well. She was a tall, thin woman with wispy blonde hair that flowed down to her waist. She kept it in a severe braid that only accentuated her height. Older than Abby by about a decade, she was kind but demanded that her employees work hard. Willow had been surprised when Abby had shown up at the inn to ask for a job. The tall woman had taken her into the back and sat her down in a corner where they could speak privately. "Are you sure this is what you want to do?" The innkeeper had asked, "I know that it hasn't been long since your husband's death. I don't want you to push yourself too hard when you're grieving." Sucking her breath in to keep the tears from overflowing once again, Abby had nodded. "I need something to do," she pleaded. "I can't sit around all day and pine for him when I know it won't bring him back. I miss Ben terribly, but I'm so unhappy." At this, Willow had given her a crooked smile. "You're lucky then. I know plenty of women who would be thrilled to be relieved of their husbands. Lucky in that, perhaps, but not in losing him." Once Abby had married the young gentleman, she had never imagined that she would have to live without him. "I'm sure you're right there. You can start tomorrow." Abby headed out to the dining floor that was so familiar now. Sure enough, the place was packed. Every seat had been taken, and several people waited near the door for chairs to open up. Quickly passing out the plates in her hand, she returned to the kitchen for more. As much as her work normally kept her mind occupied, Abby found that even the rush of this evening couldn't keep her from thinking of those letters. Would one of the envelopes in her pocket hold the key to a new future? It had been just fine to live in this small Georgia town, enduring the sticky heat of summer and watching the rebuilding of the South after the Civil War. But with her husband gone, there was little reason for her to stay. She had no family nearby. Ben's only relative in town had been his brother, but Harvey had moved shortly after the funeral. Patting her pocket with a free hand, Abby felt the crinkling of the paper. Her heart thrilled in her chest at the idea that someone worthwhile may have written to her this time. Would he be a strong country man, or a dignified city man like Ben had been? She didn't think that it really mattered who he was or what he did, as long as he was kind and loving. She hoped that she would be able to tell from a simple letter. Once she was settled down with a husband again, she would be able to go back to taking care of just one man instead of a whole inn full of them. "The table near the window needs more butter," Willow called as they passed each other. "And you forgot to put bread out for the table near the stairs." "Oh, I'm sorry." Abby rushed to fix the problem. "I don't know what's wrong with me tonight." Her boss lifted a pale eyebrow. "If I didn't know better, I might say you're in love." "Don't be silly," she countered, but a telling flush was creeping up her cheeks. Willow lifted a shoulder and let it fall. "I'll let it go for now, but don't think I won't find out sooner or later. Everyone in this town knows everything, and this inn is where they find out about it." Abby knew that she was right. Small towns always had a rumor mill, and since the Peaceful Peach was a popular gathering spot, it only made sense that most of the gossip be traded there. But that was exactly why Abby hadn't wanted to say anything about her advertisement. She didn't want any of the male customers at the inn to think she was that available. It was bad enough that there were always a few who tried to grab her elbow or start up a conversation. When the dinner crowd had finally died down, and Abby had helped clean up the mess, she finally slipped out the back door to go home. Her house wasn't far, and it was only a quick walk in the dark to get to her back door. She let herself in, lighting the lamps and trying desperately to make the townhouse feel a little warmer and more welcoming. Once Ben had died, it was as though the life had gone out of the house as well, and it was hard for her to relax in her own bed. Opening a parcel of leftover biscuits that Willow had sent home with her, Abby spread the envelopes out on the dining table and spent a few minutes simply staring at them. There was no telling what they held until she opened them, but as long as they were closed, she could imagine them to be the most amazing romantic letters in the world. Her experience with the replies she had already received told her this would not be so, but she couldn't help but dream. Unable to stand it any longer, she picked up her silver letter opener and shook out the first letter. Squinting at the script, she realized that she needed her reading glasses and had to search the house for them. A few minutes later, she settled down once again to read the note, but her glasses didn't make the effort much easier. It was scrawled in a hand that was barely legible, and the only thing she could make out was that he lived alone in the middle of the desert. Combined with the food stains that had marred the paper, Abby had no problem setting that one aside. She flipped through several more before she found one that looked promising. His handwriting was neat, and he wrote eloquently for a farmer. Located in Northern California, this man indicated that he sought a wife as a helpmate for his farm, and he warned that there would be plenty of hard work. Intrigued by his honesty, Abby felt a smile turn up the corners of her mouth. Chapter 3. "No, you can't come with me," Jed repeated for the 10th time as he readied the wagon. It was going to be a long drive into Sacramento. Though he would have enjoyed some company, he knew he was only asking for trouble if he let his brothers in on this trip. He hadn't even told them that he was going to the train station to pick up his new bride. To be, instead, making up a tale about checking out a new lumber mill that promised better, straighter boards. "But think of the print shops they must have there," Judah insisted. A voracious reader, he was eager to peruse any bookseller he could get close to. "I've been reading the same stories over and over again for the last month." Jed shook his head. "Then tell the man in Woodland to come up with new stories." "Let me come. I can help you load the boards." Josiah was always eager to work with his hands. He was the one brother whom Jed never needed to prompt to get his work done. As a matter of fact, it was much more difficult to call him in for supper than to get him up in the morning. He loved to build and create. Not this time. Jed didn't doubt that the idea of a new lumber mill intrigued him, but he would understand later. "I might not even buy anything this time. I just want to check it out." Josiah made a sour face, but didn't argue further. "That's a good thing. I don't know how much lumber you'll be able to fit in this wagon if you're going to bring it all the way from Sacramento." This came from John. He was a self-proclaimed engineer, and he had indeed proven his skills more than once. He had improved the heat output of their simple wooden stove and had cobbled together several new tools that Jed and his brothers found very useful around the farm. "I could probably put some extra length on the back of the wagon, though, and create a harness that would keep it in place as you come back up the hill," John continued. "It'll take me a little bit of time." He wandered off to the barn. Jed shook his head and laughed to himself. He didn't even need to argue with John because he was always too distracted by his ideas to worry about anything else. "Where's the other John?" he asked, looking around. "I don't think I've seen him this morning." "He's in the woods, of course." Jeremiah was the youngest brother, and he had been waiting impatiently while his brothers spoke. "I saw him slip off to hunt before we even had breakfast." "That sounds about right." Jonathan, known as the other John to his brothers, spent more time in the wilderness than he ever did in the house. A master hunter and trapper, he provided almost all the meat for their family. The only brother with red hair, while the others had the same dark locks as Jed, Jonathan was an outsider and a loner. "Tell him I said goodbye, and to make sure he gets plenty of meat for you boys while I'm gone. I'll be back as soon as I can." Jed climbed up onto the seat and clicked the horses to life. It had been difficult to keep his true errand secret from his brothers. The Rushers had always been close, and living together in one house had only reinforced that. But Jed wasn't interested in answering a ton of questions, some of which he didn't even know the answer to himself. The woman in the advertisement had given him a description of herself, but that didn't mean she had been honest. And he could only guess by the way she wrote that she was educated and kind, but a letter was no substitute for someone's true attitude. For all he knew, they would meet at the train station in Sacramento, hate each other instantly, and go back to their respective homes. By the time he arrived in Sacramento, much of the day had already passed. Once he picked up his new bride, they would have just enough time to get into Woodland before dark. There would be no way he could navigate the steep and curvy roads up to his homestead once the sun had set, and he wouldn't risk doing something so dangerous with a woman in tow. Steering through the busy streets to the train station, Jed hoped he had made the right decision. There had been a number of advertisements he could have responded to, but he wanted to find the right one. He had been honest when he had replied, explaining that life with him would mean a lot of hard work. Perhaps in a way he had been hoping it would keep anyone from writing back to him. He thought he wanted a wife, but what if it wasn't all it was cracked up to be? His new wife might keep him under her thumb just like Thomas's wife did, or she might be too delicate for life in the wilderness. There was no more time to think about it. Jed parked the wagon and strode out onto the platform just as the train chugged into the station. He watched as the big locomotive screeched to a halt, blowing out vast amounts of steam that hung in a fog over the platform before dissipating into the air. The place was busier than he had expected, with numerous folks waiting for passengers to disembark. His heart thudded in his chest as he recited to himself what this Abigail woman he had written to had told him about how to recognize her. But there could be any number of women getting off the train who had dark blonde hair, hazel eyes, and a pink rose pinned to her dress. Jed watched attentively as businessmen and families stepped down onto the platform. A hefty woman with a lumpy face stepped down next, and he was happy to see that she went eagerly into the waiting arms of her husband. Jed blew out a deep breath, growing more impatient by the second. Finally, a beautiful young woman with porcelain skin stepped off the train. Her deep gold locks hung down past her shoulders, ending in dainty curls that bounced as she walked. She kept her eyes on her feet as she descended the steps to the platform. But her hazel eyes were like a beacon that swept the area once she stood on solid ground. Over a head shorter than Jed was, she held her curvy body with grace and dignity. Jed sucked his breath back in when he saw that she did indeed have a pink rose pinned to her bodice. He strode forward, wanting to reach her quickly, but not wanting to appear too eager. The woman's eyes locked on his as he approached, and her smile lit up her face. "Abigail?" he asked tentatively. "I'm Jed. I hope your trip was pleasant." He realized how stiff and formal he sounded, but he didn't know how to stop it. There was no way he could be the relaxed, jovial man he was around his brothers. This woman deserved to be charmed, and he wanted to be the one to do it. After all, they would be married in less than a day. He only had so much time to impress her before they got back to Woodland and said their vows. Yes, it was. "Thank you. And please call me Abby." She held out her hand. Her voice was soft and pleasant, like honey over a hot biscuit. Jed took her tiny fingers in his and bent over them to drop a kiss on the back of her glove. He couldn't remember ever behaving this way, except when his mother had coached him for a country dance when he was 15. There was something about this woman that brought out the best in him, and they had only known each other for a few seconds. "I'd be happy to, Abby." Chapter 4. Abby's fingers shook as she adjusted the buttons on her gown. For the third time, she checked herself in the mirror repeatedly, wanting to look as perfect as possible for her new groom. Jed had impressed her from the moment she stepped off the train. The trip to California had taken an eternity, and she had spent the time worrying about what she would find when she reached Sacramento. She had tried to convince herself that she had nothing to worry about. From the way Jed wrote, he was a gentleman farmer. She was going to have a full, wonderful life in California, but she also knew that disappointment was no stranger in the West, and she was not guaranteed happiness. The man who stepped forward and introduced himself was more than she ever could have hoped for. He was immensely tall, a virtual giant among the crowd on the platform. His dark, curly hair suited his olive complexion, and he had the beginnings of a beard clinging to his chin. Jed was thin, but he had wide shoulders, and farm work had hardened his muscles and roughened his hands. Ben had been every bit a banker, with soft hands, pale skin, and a quiet disposition. He never did any rough work himself, but paid someone else to do it, commissioning others to care for his horse and repair the house. It had never bothered Abby to be married to a sophisticated man, but she found Jed to be a refreshing change of pace. Someone who reminded her too much of her late husband would be painful to be with, and Jed was pleasant and kind. After he had loaded her trunks into his wagon, a task which he refused to let the porters assist him with. Jed had boosted Abby up into the wagon as though she weighed no more than a doll. They had spent the ride from Sacramento to Woodland, either engaged in active conversation about themselves or peaceful silence. She was impressed that she could feel so comfortable around a stranger. Now that her wedding day had arrived, however, she felt completely different. It was a beautiful, clear, warm day, but she felt chilly. Her stomach quivered inside her, and the vibrations set her bones shaking. Abby had prepared well for the day, bringing a specially made gown and new matching boots with her from Georgia. She had even practiced dressing her hair for the occasion, and before she had left her home she had mastered the style, but now her fingers didn't want to do what they were told. She had taken out the pins and redone her hair at least twice and was beginning to think she would never be ready. A soft knock came at her door. Jed and Abby had stayed the night in separate rooms at a local inn, and though it was not as busy as the peaceful Peach, it had made Abby feel a little bit at home. The small girl with wide eyes on the other side of the door, whom Abby recognized as one of the maids, smiled when she took in the sight of the new bride. "They sent me up to tell you everything's ready at the chapel." "Thank you." Abby swallowed, trying unsuccessfully to quell her nerves. The only way to get past this was to get it over with. She followed the girl down the stairs to the chapel next door. Cued by the organ music, Abby marched slowly forward. Her body seemed to calm down as she looked to Jed, who waited for her by the altar. He smiled softly at her, and she knew that she was heading in the right direction. Her husband's death had left her drifting through life, but now she had something definitive to look forward to and to work for. His warm hand folded around hers when she reached him, and Abby had to resist the urge to lean against him. He seemed so solid, and she was grateful to have found a good, strong man. The litany of the preacher barely skimmed her ears, and she was surprised to hear herself say, "I do," at the right time. Just as she tipped her head back to allow the groom his first kiss, a horrific explosion of noise sounded just outside the front doors. The few people gathered in the chapel turned their attention from the new couple and stood up to peer out the windows. "What's going on?" Jed asked sharply. A thin, older man with glasses answered, "Just a brawl at the saloon." At this information, the groom seemed to relax. He smiled down at Abby. "Nothing to worry about. Thomas will get it under control." He pressed his lips to hers. Still overwhelmed by it all, Abby's nerves jumped to life again as the commotion continued. The crashing and shouting was getting louder, and she wondered just how much fighting happened out west. "It sounds terrible," she murmured as Jed once again took her hand and began guiding her back down the aisle. Jed nodded. "Yes, but Harvey always gets like that if he gets a little too deep in his cups." Just then, the chapel door burst open. A blond man with a bulky build and thin hair came staggering in. "Fine, you think I drink too much. I guess I'll just spend some time going to church then. At least I know they won't kick me out here." The chapel faded away around Abby as she realized who the drunkard was. This was not just some stranger in a strange town who had started a bar fight and subsequently ruined her wedding. "Harvey, what are you doing here?" The blond man turned around in confusion. "What?" "I can go to church if I want to." "Wait." He pointed a finger at Abby, using his other hand to hold himself up against the doorframe. "You look just like my brother's wife." Abby's fingers clenched in Jed's hand until her knuckles hurt. "I am. Or I was." "I didn't know you lived here." Harvey shrugged, and the movement made him stagger a little. "It's a free country, ain't it? I had to go somewhere after Ben died. I see you decided to move along yourself. What do you think you're doing here in that dress when you're married to my brother?" Taking a deep breath, Abby struggled with what to say next. There was no point in arguing with a drunk, and Harvey was stubborn even when he was sober. He had moved away after Ben's funeral, stating that Georgia just wasn't the same without his brother, but he'd never left a forwarding address. He was the last person she expected to see in Woodland, California. Of an even deeper concern was what might be going through Jed's mind. She didn't want her new husband to think she was secretly married to someone else or that she hadn't spent her time mourning. "Harvey, you and I both know that Ben has been dead for a long time. Now I would thank you to remove yourself from this chapel and go sleep it off for a while," she hissed. Ben's brother stuck out his lower lip like a pouting child. "Oh, I see. You think just because I've had a few that I don't understand what's going on. But it doesn't take a genius to know that my brother wouldn't have wanted you to remarry. This is not the place. Get out, Harvey." Jed's voice was commanding and deep. "You don't belong here." The blond man squinted up at this new challenger, sizing him up. "Yeah, I'll go, but not because you told me to. I have things to do." He turned around and took a step through the doorway, but cast an angry glance over his shoulder. "Don't think I'm not keeping an eye on you." Abby watched him stagger off down the street. She suddenly felt sad and disappointed when she knew she should have been happy. Harvey had not been right. Ben wouldn't have wanted her to be lonely, nor would he have wanted her to be lonely, nor would he have wanted Harvey to have taken his death so hard. But it wasn't as easy to convince herself when she was accused of betrayal, before the wedding was even over. "I take it you know him?" Jed asked quietly as they walked hand in hand back to the inn. He had explained that his home was up in the hills and that he wanted to spend another night in town before they made the journey. It would give them a little time together before the work of the farm took over their lives. Abby watched the dusty ground under her boots, too scared to look up at her new husband. She had embarrassed him already, and they hadn't even been married for an hour. "As I'm sure you figured out, he's my late husband's brother. I knew he had gone west, but I didn't know he was here." "I'm so sorry." His fingers squeezed hers gently. "Don't be sorry. He's already made a name for himself here as a reckless drunk. What happened was his fault, not yours." Though Jed's words were kind, Abby felt tears stinging the backs of her eyes. If moving across the country wasn't enough to start her life over, then how could she truly find happiness? I don't know. I didn't want it to be like this." Jed wrapped a comforting arm around her, and Abby melted into him. "If there is anything I've learned about living out here, it's that life is never what you expect it to be." Chapter 5. The next morning, Jed waited patiently by the wagon as Abby finished getting ready and packing up for the trip home. He scuffed his boots into the ground, fiddled with the horse's harness, and rearranged her trunks in the wagon. The two of them should have been easy around each other, now that they'd had their wedding night, but he found himself trying to think of what to say to her once she emerged from the inn. "Mornin', Jed," called Monroe as he came across the street. "Is your bride all right this morning? That was quite a scene at the chapel yesterday." Jed rubbed a hand over his freshly shaven jaw. The store clerk had spoken his own fears aloud. "I hope so. It was quite a surprise, and I don't think she appreciated it much. I plan on getting her out of town just as fast as I can." "Are you worried that he's making her reconsider?" "I've heard of mail-order brides running off after they realize they aren't cut out for the rough life of the West. Jed shook his head. I don't think that's going to be a problem. I'm more worried about Harvey harassing her, and we both know he isn't a man to be trusted. I think I'm just going to keep him well away from Abby and forget about the whole thing. Monroe looked toward the saloon, no doubt thinking of the events the day before. I wish you luck on that one, Jed. He shuffled off toward the general store. Abby emerged from the front door of the inn. She had dressed in a much simpler gown than the one she had worn for their wedding, made of pale blue gingham. There was a matching bonnet to go with it, and though she was dressed for travel, Jed couldn't help but notice how lucky he was. He had landed himself one beautiful wife. Her cheeks were rosy against her soft, pale skin, and she looked up at him demurely as she approached the wagon. I hope I didn't keep you waiting too long. Not at all. In that moment, Jed would have waited an entire day just to see her. His brothers were going to be so jealous when they found out what he'd done. He hoisted her up into the wagon and then joined her on the seat, proud to have his wife at his side. They were quiet as they made their way through downtown and reached the city limits. Abby fidgeted next to him, but he chalked it up to nerves. If she was feeling anything like he was this morning, then he couldn't blame her for being quiet. I know you said I shouldn't apologize, she said as they rolled past the last few houses on the edge of town, but I really am sorry for yesterday. Her sudden words startled him, but Jed recovered quickly. So that was the problem. She was still worried about Harvey intruding on their wedding. He glanced at her but quickly returned his eyes to watching the bob of the horses' backs. I like to think we can just put it behind us. Like I said, Harvey is known for causing trouble. Abby didn't seem to hear his words, or if she did, then she didn't believe them. I understand if it's too much for you, and if you want me to go back to Georgia. It was a terrible surprise. Too much. Jed struggled to understand her meaning. Oh, no. Darling, if I didn't want to be married to you, then I wouldn't have gone this far with it. I could have had our vows annulled right away if Harvey had upset me that much. He could see from her downcast face that he hadn't made her feel any better. It was going to take some time to get used to talking to a woman properly. Not that I would have, he assured her. I mean, there wasn't a need to, so I wouldn't have. But if there was, then I could. But there wasn't. Well, you know what I mean. He concentrated on the road ahead of him instead of trying to explain himself any further. I just don't want you to feel uncomfortable with this marriage, Abby continued to explain. I'm concerned that Harvey may have given you the wrong impression of me, and I don't want you to worry that perhaps I'm not the most upstanding woman. I can promise you that my husband has been deceased for a long time, but that doesn't mean you'll accept that. Jed bit his lip to keep from laughing with joy. How was he lucky enough to find a woman who was beautiful, sweet, and honest to a fault? There wasn't much anyone could say that would change his mind about her, much less some loose like Harvey Kirkman. You aren't going anywhere. Not if I have a say in it. But I am curious about something. She looked up at him with wide eyes. What's that? What's Harvey's problem? Why was he so upset to see that you were getting remarried? If he was honest with himself, this was the only issue he had with the scene at the chapel. Jed believed Abby about her husband, and she had explained in her letters that she was a widow, but he'd never seen a relative get so angry about something so commonplace. Lots of women got remarried. His wife heaved a sigh and turned to watch the trees pass by. Harvey and his brother were very close. He moved down to Georgia to be near Ben, even though he had plenty going for him back in South Carolina. Ben was everything to him. When he died unexpectedly, Harvey just couldn't take it. He disappeared only a few days after the funeral, and everyone said he had moved off to another state. I didn't really think about him anymore after that, but I sure never expected to find him here. Jed pursed his lips as he mulled this over. It made some sense, and it aligned with Harvey's personality. I want you to know that I'm really not concerned about what Harvey thinks or wants. But do you think he's going to cause any further trouble? I don't want to have to do something that I'll regret. Abby's cheeks flushed at this, but she shook her head. No, I don't think he'll do anything else. He had his say, and I think half the town heard him. He'll sober up and forget that I'm even here. Jed was willing to accept this for the moment, but he wasn't convinced. Harvey didn't have a reputation for being a reasonable man. Sober or not. Fortunately, Jed's house was far enough into the hills that he doubted the man would ever darken his doorstep. If he did, Jed was fully prepared to do whatever was necessary to protect his new wife. Chapter 6. Abby felt more comfortable in the wagon next to her husband, once she had told him of her concerns. She had spent the night worrying that he would think she had misled him, and the last thing she wanted was to start this new marriage on false pretenses. Once they had discussed Harvey, she was finally able to relax on the wagon seat next to Jed, and she allowed herself to dream of the days to come. "We're nearly there now," Jed said as he maneuvered around a turn in the road. "My land starts just over there. The house is near the center of the property, so we're surrounded on all sides by our own pastures and crops." Abby gazed in wonder at the beautiful land they were entering. The hills rolled gently around them, verdant with grass and trees, until they broke away into freshly tilled earth. She could easily imagine the two of them living up here alone together, working the land and carving out a life for themselves. Maybe they would even be blessed with children to help them. Abby had often longed for a little girl to sit beside her as she sewed and cooked, learning how to take care of a family and a household. Jed raised a hand to hail a man who had just emerged from the tree line onto the road. The newcomer bore a startling resemblance to her husband, except that his hair was a brilliant red. He carried a brace of rabbits on his hip and a gun over his shoulder, and he watched the couple quizzically as they rolled past. "That's my brother, Jonathan," Jed explained, clearing up the mystery. "We call him the other Joan, since I have a brother named John with an HA as well." Though she could have asked him why he hadn't stopped to introduce his new wife, Abby decided to let it go. She was too excited about seeing the house, and she wasn't eager for things to become awkward again between her and Jed. "Does he live around here?" she asked instead. Jed's face froze for a moment as though he had just remembered something. "Yes, he does." As they continued up the road, Jed was soon greeting another man. This one had dark hair like Jed, but he was shorter and even thinner. He sat in the curve of an oak tree's roots, his hat pulled down over his eyes and an open book on his lap. "Judah," Jed called out. "Get your lazy hind end up and get back to work. There are plenty of crops that need to be sown yet." Startled, Judah scrambled to his feet and dropped his book in the grass. He stared at Abby, forgetting to tip his hat until it was too late. "Another brother?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am. With over 150 acres here, there's plenty of land that needs working. We don't have time for idle hands." Abby had been looking forward to spending time just with Jed, but if his brothers were nearby and willing to help out on the land, then it would only lighten the load for her. She thought she could just see the roofline of the house at the top of the hill, and her heart surged toward it. Unfortunately, Jed had to stop the wagon as two more men came running down the road and stood in front of it. "Come on now, boys. I'm tired and I want to get home." He turned to his wife. "This is Josiah and Jeremiah. I'm sorry they're being so rude." "Do you need any help unloading the wagon?" Josiah asked eagerly. He put his hands in his pockets, took them out and put them on his hips, and then crossed his arms in front of him as though he didn't know what to do with the useless appendages. "Let me help. I can do it better," Jeremiah countered. "No, you can't." Josiah now balled his fists at his sides. "If there's serious work to be done, then I'm the one who needs to do it." Jeremiah's face colored with rage. "Don't you start that with me. Just because you're older doesn't mean you're better." Josiah looked smug. "We're all older than you, and we're all better." "Boys, boys!" Jed bellowed. "Get out of the way and let us through. I'll unpack the wagon myself. Thank you very much." He reached across the wagon seat and patted Abby's hand. "I'm sorry about that. It's nice that they want to help, but they get a little overly enthusiastic about it." "That's all right," she assured him. "I'm sure that just means there's plenty of eager workers around." "That's true," Jed agreed. "And here's another one right here." They had just pulled up to the house. Abby looked where her husband pointed to a husky man chopping wood. He resembled the other Rushers as well, except that he was built like an ox. He hurled the axe down onto each log with ease, sending the firewood flying. The man looked up at the couple, bobbed his head to acknowledge them, and went back to work. "You'll have to pardon Joshua," Jed said as he pulled the wagon to a halt near the house and jumped down. He turned around and brought Abby safely to the ground after him. "He's a bit shy. In fact, you might never hear him say more than a few words in a month's time. But he's as strong as he looks, and he can work all day without getting tired." Abby's attention had drifted away from the man chopping wood and was now focused on the house. The dream home she had imagined at the top of the hill was little more than a large shack. It listed heavily to the right, and there were several holes in the porch decking. The roof that covered the porch was thick with moss, and the supports that were supposed to hold it up were nearly diagonal in places. Bits of broken tools lay scattered about the yard, and grass had grown up around the split rail fence. The land and the crops were beautiful, but it was clear that Jed and the other Rusher boys had little time for the house. "I know it needs a little work." Jed looked at the house, and Abby wondered if he had ever bothered to actually see it before, or if it was just a roof he slept under. Surely he hadn't given any thought to what a woman's impression of it would be. "I have some plans for fixing it up, but it does its job." He stepped up onto the porch and patted the wall of the house affectionately, causing a plank of the cedar siding to slide down and crash down onto the porch. "Josiah will fix that. Come on in." An old blue heeler crawled out from under the porch. His entire face had gone gray, and he walked with a slight limp, but he wagged his tail and put his ears back as he approached Abby and shoved his muzzle under her hand. She obliged him with a pet, dusting her fingers on her apron afterwards. Hesitantly, Abby picked her way up the slanted steps to the door, noting as she crossed the threshold that it didn't quite seem to fit in the doorway anymore. The interior of the house was just as disappointing as the outside. It was dark and dingy, with cobwebs clinging to the corners and more junk cluttering the floor and tabletop. There were large boot prints in the dust on the floor, and the mismatched dishes in the kitchen were in varying states of dirtiness. At the very least, the place looked as though it would be big enough to hold the two of them and any children they might have. The dog had followed them into the house, and he settled down onto a rug and heaved a loud sigh. Jed turned around to look at him. "This is Boomer," he said, stooping down to ruffle the dog's ears. Boomer looked up at him gratefully before settling his chin back on his paws. He used to come out with me to all edges of the farm to guard the livestock and keep the coyotes at bay, but he doesn't get around too well anymore. I have a new hound that stays out by the barn, but you probably won't see her anywhere near the house." Abby felt sorry for the ancient canine, but at least he had a comfortable place to sleep at night. And she doubted that the dog cared how dirty the floor was or if the windows had curtains. "Where do your brothers live?" she asked, looking to find anything to say that would keep her from berating her new husband over the condition of his house. "I didn't see any other houses on the way up here." Jed eyed her cautiously. "Well, they live here." A heavy silence fell between them that was thicker than the dust in the air. Abby was sure she couldn't have heard him right. "You mean here on the property? They have their houses on the other edge of a field somewhere." Abby tried to peer out one of the windows, but it was coated with grime. "No," Jed replied, rubbing his hand along his jaw. Abby noticed that it was stubbly already, despite the fact that he had shaved that morning. "They live here, in this house," he gestured around him. "There's plenty of room, though. The loft has 2 big bedrooms that the boys share, and we'll have our bedroom over here in the back." All the hopes and dreams Abby had for this marriage were suddenly shattered at her feet. This was not at all how she had pictured things. "And I assume it's safe to say that none of them are married?" Jed laughed, a deep rumble that reverberated through the room. "Yes, it's very safe to say that. I don't think a woman would want anything to do with them." Abby fumed. She knew what this meant. "I see. You didn't bring me here to be your wife. You just wanted a housekeeper, and I not only have to clean up after you, but your 5 brothers as well?" Her husband looked sheepish. "6, actually. I don't know where John is, but you haven't met him yet." Crossing her arms in front of her chest, Abby could feel her eyebrows draw down on her forehead as she scowled at Jed. "How could you not tell me about this?" Jed shrugged. "I didn't really think about it, and it never came up." "It never came up," Abby fumed. "I didn't realize I had to ask you if you had a bunch of slovenly brothers living with you." Jed placed his big hands on her shoulders in a gesture that he must have thought was comforting. "Look, I know this has probably been a lot for you to take in. It's a big change from what you're used to. I'll leave you to settle in while I unpack the wagon. The kitchen's right there, and it's not too early to start dinner. We're always hungry." He dropped a quick peck on her forehead and went back out the front door. Abby stared after him in astonishment. Surely this wasn't happening. She thought she had given up a life of taking care of multiple people at the inn, and now she still had an entire houseful to look after. It was clear from the filth around her that they weren't capable of doing it themselves. They took care of the land and made sure they were warm in the winter, but that was about it. She stared dismally at the slew of dirty dishes in the kitchen. Stacks of plates and precarious towers of pots and pans covered the table, and even more could be found in the sink. She could leave right then, insist that Jed take her back to Woodland, and make her way back to Georgia. But there was nothing waiting for her there now. Eventually, maybe she and Jed could make this work. Picking up a scrub brush, Abby filled the sink and began attacking the mess. She wasn't going to be able to cook until she had at least some of it cleaned up, and it was going to take at least a week to catch up with this much grime just in the kitchen. Then, of course, she would need to move on to the floors and windows, and she shuddered to think what the laundry must be like. Exhausted even before she got started, Abby scrubbed away. Chapter 7. Once Jed had unloaded the wagon, he did as he had promised and left Abby alone in the house. She had surprised him with her reaction, but Jed didn't really blame her. She was probably already tired from traveling across the country, and he didn't doubt that the wedding and the subsequent ride-up to the homestead had worn her out even further. A few days of routine life, and she would be back to normal again. He strolled out into the yard, where his brothers had gathered to question him. "What's going on?" John asked as he strolled up to the group. "It looks like I missed something while I was making a new hayloft for the barn." "Jed here came home with a woman," Jeremiah piped up. "Who is she, Jed? And how did you get her to come all the way out here?" "He must have tricked her," offered Jedidiah. "No woman would come up here otherwise." Jed put his hands on his hips and looked at his brothers derisively. "For your information, I married her." The Rusher boys paused for a moment before letting out whoops of laughter. "Yup, he tricked her all right," Judah confirmed, causing another round of laughter amongst the brothers. Now. Jed held his hands out to calm the crowd. "I thought it was about time we had a woman around here. We'll have hot food in our bellies, a clean house, and maybe even some clean clothes for once." "Why didn't you tell us?" Jeremiah asked. "You know perfectly well why I didn't," Jed replied. "I can hardly take you boys into town without a big ordeal on my hands, much less bring you to meet a new bride and attend a wedding. I brought her all the way out here from Georgia, and I didn't want to scare her off first thing." John nodded at this wisdom. "I guess I can see that. But I'm surprised that she didn't turn around and run back down the hill when she arrived. You know, I'm not a picky man, but our house isn't exactly a decent one, or very strong." "Then I guess you better get to fixing it," Jed admonished his brother. "I told Abby there would be plenty of work for her, but she'll have enough on her hands with cooking and cleaning and looking after this lot. The least you can do is get this yard picked up and fix the roof. We've been letting things go around here, and it's time to stop." Jed hadn't thought much about the homestead until he had arrived with Abby. The look on her face showed him everything he hadn't seen. The wind damage that he had repaired was only a drop in the bucket compared to everything else that needed to be done, but he was confident that he and his brothers could get it taken care of, and then Abby would have nothing to complain about. A thin voice called across the yard, "Supper's ready." The resulting stampede of rushers was enough to shake the ground, and Jed cringed as they stomped across the porch. The last thing he needed was for the boys to break something else before they got it all fixed. He came in last to find the boys fighting over seats at the table. Abby had completely transformed the kitchen in the few hours since she had arrived. The table was completely laden with platters of hot food, and most of the dirty dishes had been washed and put away. Even the kitchen floor had been swept and mopped, and Jed realized he had forgotten what the wood underneath looked like. "It smells delicious in here," Jed told her as he took his seat at the head of the table. "Where did you learn to cook?" He noticed that though Abby had pulled her hair back into a tight braid while she cooked and cleaned, several strands the color of dark honey had pulled loose to frame her face. Her cheeks glowed from the hard work, but the effect didn't carry into her eyes. "The inn that I worked at was well known for its good food. I was a decent cook anyway, but I learned a lot when I helped out in the kitchen." She sat down slowly in her chair across from him and eyed the table listlessly. Whatever else she said was drowned out by the noise of his brothers as they ate, clattering dishes and talking with their mouths full. Even the dog was thrilled to have a cook in the house. Boomer tucked himself under the table and visited each brother in turn, begging for scraps of meat or a spoonful of gravy. He licked his chops and sighed with pleasure as his belly filled. Jed tucked into his food as well. dishing up heaping mounds of mashed potatoes and gravy, a big pile of green beans, and generous slices of beef. He had to force himself to slow down and chew so he could enjoy the flavor. But it had been so long since he'd had a good homemade meal that he couldn't stop shoveling it in. As he wiped gravy off his chin, he looked up to see that Abby barely had any food on her plate. She had taken a dainty slice of the beef and was poking it with her fork, staring down at her plate with a heavy sadness. Jed looked around at his brothers to see who had offended her, but they were eating and joking with each other as though she didn't even exist. Despite the delicious food he had just eaten, an unsettled feeling took over Jed's stomach. Abby had been acting differently ever since they had arrived at the house. He had expected his brothers to be jealous of him for finding such a catch, but they just gobbled their food and ignored her. It wasn't that he expected them to sit down and have a sophisticated conversation with her, but there was definitely something wrong. This feeling only increased as the boys finished their dinners and began to leave the table. They tossed their napkins on their dirty plates, shoved their chairs back, and stomped off to the living room to flop down on the sofa or a chair. Abby didn't even look up at them as they did so. She let out a small sigh and began stacking the dirty plates. Since his brothers seemed to have occupied themselves well enough with a game of cards before the evening chores started, Jed took advantage of a moment alone with his wife. He reached out and touched her elbow as she passed by him with an armful of dirty dishes. "Are you feeling all right?" he asked quietly. Abby paused, looking down at him with a sharp look in her eyes that he hadn't seen before. She seemed to stare right through him, and he didn't like the way it made him feel. "I'm fine," she finally replied curtly. Jed knew that couldn't be the truth, or at least not all of it. Shrugging, he put his napkin on the table and went to join the boys. Out of the corner of his eye, he watched Abby as she retrieved the remainder of the dishes and took them to the kitchen. He couldn't see her once she was behind the kitchen door, but the rattling of crockery told him that at least she was busy. Chapter 8. During the meal, Abby had worked hard to keep her face like stone. She knew that if she allowed herself even one frown, she would completely lose control. It was easier to do it once she was safely ensconced in the kitchen, where nobody could see. She furrowed her brow deeply as she took out her anger on pots and pans and scraped the scraps into a bowl for Boomer. The dog followed her into the kitchen and was soon snoring peacefully behind the stove. Abby didn't know how she had managed to get herself into this mess. She'd had plenty of work to do at the inn, and she was no stranger to cooking, cleaning, washing dishes, and any other kitchen work. But she'd never had to do it by herself when she was taking care of more than a few people, and the Rusher boys made a massive mess when they ate. She had yet to wipe the puddles of gravy off the dining table, but she wasn't ready to show her face in front of the men yet. She needed more time to compose herself. By the time she had finished cleaning the dishes she had used to make and serve dinner, Abby's feet were sore from standing on the hard floor and her hands were wrinkled like raisins. But there were still plenty of dishes from before she had arrived, and she didn't want to wake up in the morning and still have to see the mess. She filled up the sink once again and carried on. Eventually, the boys made their way back out of the house to give the livestock their evening feedings, and Abby let out a long breath. It was the perfect opportunity for her to sneak out of the kitchen, across the living room, and to her new bedroom. No, their bedroom. She allowed herself a sour look as she remembered that she had to share even that small space with Jed. There would be no place on this farm where she would be able to be alone except the kitchen, and that only meant work. Closing the bedroom door behind her, Abby lit a small lamp against the gloomy evening light. She sighed again when she realized that her trunks had all been piled in the corner and nothing had been unpacked. As much as she wanted to simply collapse onto the bed fully dressed, she knew she would be too busy in the morning cooking breakfast to be sorting through her clothes. Abby knelt in front of one of the trunks and popped it open. The dress she had worn for their wedding lay on the very top, and tears came unbidden to her eyes. How had she been such a fool? Abby had wanted so badly to start her life over and get away from everything that reminded her of Ben. She had imagined that she could have a lovely romance with a new man, and that perhaps she and her second husband could live happily ever after. But it was clear after being married for less than 2 days that she was not going to be happy here. Jed could claim all he wanted to, that he had forgotten to tell her about his family, but having 6 brothers wasn't the sort of thing one simply forgot. How could he not have realized that the Rushers were a lot to take care of, and that one woman wasn't going to be able to do it alone? Tears plopped down onto the dusty floor as she relived their first meal together. The boys were rude and lacked manners, fighting over the platters of food and chewing with their mouths open. Abby easily could have picked up a wooden spoon and started smacking each and every one of them. Except she wasn't certain how Jed would react. What if he was angry with her for trying to change them? The only family member who seemed to appreciate her and her efforts was Boomer. At least it was acceptable if he gobbled his meal with his mouth open and fell asleep right afterwards. His tail wag of thanks was more than she had gotten from the men. Then again, she thought, as she swiftly pulled dresses from the trunk and hung them in her closet, this was to be her house as well. Jed had married her and made her his partner. If he didn't want her input, then he never should have written to her or brought her all the way out to California. She didn't have to leave everything as it was simply because Jed and the boys had always lived that way. Gaining energy once again as she worked, Abby pulled out her spare shoes and lined them up in the bottom of the wardrobe. She found her Bible and placed it on the nightstand, deciding that she didn't care if Jed wanted it there or not. He had gotten himself a wife, and he was just going to have to deal with it. Maybe she would even get some lacy fabric to make curtains with or put flowers near the mirror. The sound of heavy footsteps crossing the living room brought her back to the current moment, and she swiped at her eyes with the back of her wrist. She would have to be strong if she was going to be one of the Rushers, and that meant nobody could catch her crying. The door opened and Jed ducked in, a smile on his face and mud on his boots. Abby frowned at the tracks he had made across the room, but she said nothing. She would bide her time as she could. "Here you are," Jed said. "I finished with the horses and the cattle, and I was going to show you where we keep the chicken feeds so you know how to take care of them in the morning. I thought you might still be in the kitchen." Abby didn't look at him. She didn't want to lose control all over again, and if she looked at his face, she knew she would do just that. He was handsome, and she had been silly enough to fall for him and let him bring her to the middle of nowhere. "I finished," she replied bluntly. Jed nodded and rubbed the bristles on his chin. Abby wondered just how fast his facial hair grew, since he looked like he would have a full beard within a couple of days if he just set his razor down. "It looks like you're making quite a bit of progress with unpacking your things." The tone of his voice lifted at the end of the statement, as though he had hopes about her happiness or even doubts as to whether or not she would stay. Yes. There was nothing else for Abby to say, not until Jed stopped being so blind and ignorant. She busied herself with dusting off her Sunday hat and setting it on a shelf in the wardrobe. Her husband shuffled his big feet on the floor, leaving even more of a mess for her to sweep up later. "Are you sure you feel well? Are you sure you feel well? I understand you've had a long trip, but you just don't quite seem to be yourself." At this, Abby rounded on him. She could feel her chin jutting out defiantly, but she didn't care. And just what would you know about who I am? We've known each other for all of 2 days, her hands curled into fists at her sides. Jed blinked, taken aback by this sudden attack. I just mean that you seem a little different now. He was fully flustered as he searched for more words. You seemed so happy before, and now... Abby pulled the last few items out of her trunk, flung them into the wardrobe, and slammed the door. Really, Jed? You figured out that I'm not happy. Maybe now you can figure out why? Jed took a step back and put his hands up in self-defense, even though she had made no move to come at him. What did I do? Now Abby did advance across the room until she had him in the doorway. It's what you didn't do, Jed, and what you probably never will. But I'll tell you this much, just because we're married doesn't mean I'll share a bed with you. If I have to, I'll go outside and sleep with the horses. She hadn't planned to say any of this and wasn't sure where it came from, but it felt good. Abby didn't have to put up with him or go by his rules, and she would find a place to call her own, even if it meant waking up every morning with hay in her hair. There was surprise and pain in Jed's liquid brown eyes, but Abby knew she had to remain stoic. Her husband was only going to continue to take advantage of her, and she couldn't fall for his sweet looks again. It would only mean more misery for both of them. That won't be necessary, Jed finally replied. I'll sleep in the barn myself. He turned on his heel and clomped back out of the house. Abby slammed the door behind him, ignoring the whispers she heard from the living room. The rest of the Rushers must have come in from their evening chores during the argument, and Abby had been too busy berating her husband to notice. But that was fine. Let them know that she had put Jed in his place, and let it serve as a warning that she would do the same to them soon enough. Exhausted and emotionally wrecked, Abby collapsed onto the bed. She grabbed a pillow and wailed into it, letting the tears flow freely. She may have gotten her way for the moment, but the battle was far from over. She had a lot of work ahead of her, and not just housework. When the bedroom door creaked open again, a few minutes later, Abby stiffened and prepared for Jed to rake her over the coals. But a soft muzzle wheezed in her ear, and she reached down to lay her hand on Boomer's head. He collapsed on the floor next to the bed, snoring softly. Eventually, with her hand still on the dog's head, Abby fell asleep without even taking her boots off. Chapter 9. Jed hammered the nail home and reached for another one. The last few days had been filled with nothing but hard work, but at least it kept him out of the house. When he came in for meals, his wife pretended that he didn't even exist. Though he assumed he deserved it somehow, it didn't mean he enjoyed it. For the moment, it was easier to stay out of her way. He focused on taking care of the farm and catching up on some of the repairs he had been meaning to do. As he moved on to the next section of barn roof, he realized just how far behind he had gotten. Life had been busy, and there was always something that needed attention. Frowning as he pounded in another shingle, he knew that he could only blame himself. He had let the boys spend their extra time reading or hunting or shooting at old cans when they should have been painting the barn or repairing the fence line. It had been too easy to allow them to slack off a little. But the truth was that the work really never did end. Even though there were 7 of them to run the homestead, something always needed to be done. He would have to change their attitudes before the house fell in on itself. More so than the shabbiness of his farm, the issue with his wife weighed on Jed's mind. He could mend a roof or repair a gate, but he had no idea how to fix his relationship, especially since he didn't know what was wrong with it. So what if? The farm needed a little work. He was doing his best, and if that was her problem, then she should have noticed that he was making an effort. But still she kept her shoulders stiff and her mouth a hard line when he was anywhere near her. Several times he had thought to sit down with Abby and just ask her outright, but the way she turned her cheek away from him and stormed off into another room every time he entered the house told him that she wouldn't be receptive to that. A cloud of dust over the road signaling a visitor brought his attention away from his troubles. Jed carefully backed down the ladder and into the yard just as Dale pulled up in his wagon. Dale had purchased a large plot of land just down the road from the Rushers, and the two men had come to know each other well over the last few years. Dale would help him brand his cattle, and Jed had ridden down to Dale's place to lend a hand in fixing a wagon or two. The town of Woodland was small enough that folks couldn't help but run into each other, and Jed and Dale had often sat down together in the saloon or the inn. "What brings you by on this beautiful day?" Jed asked, forcing a smile. Though Dale was his friend, he didn't want to let anyone know about his marital troubles. It would only make him look like an even bigger fool than he apparently was. Dale hopped down from the wagon seat. He took his hat off and swiped a hand through the curly brown mass of his hair that blended down into his shaggy beard. A heavy man, Dale had round cheeks that made his small eyes look even smaller when he smiled. "Well, I'm afraid it isn't good news." Concerned, Jed set down his bucket of nails, dusted off his hands, and gestured for Dale to have a seat with him on some nearby logs that Joshua had yet to chop. Not just a friendly visit, then, eh? He realized as he sat down that he hadn't seen Jonathan since the argument with Abby. He would have to head out to the woods and drag him back in soon before he went native. Dale shook his head, causing his wild beard to flap in the breeze as he plopped his heavy frame onto a large stump. "I'm afraid not. Harvey Kirkman has been causing some trouble." Jed didn't like the sound of this. He had already vowed that Harvey wouldn't be his problem, and that he wouldn't even give a thought to his wife's former brother-in-law. But now that the blonde rogue had made his connection to Abby known to the entire town, it seemed there wasn't going to be any getting away from him soon. "He's always up to something," Jed hedged. "What did he do? Start another fight at the saloon?" Dale nodded into his beard, but his eyes were grave. "He did, but he took it a step too far this time. He injured the man he was fighting with, and he landed himself in jail for the night. He's lucky it was only a small cut and that the sheriff happened to pass by when he did. Otherwise, he might have done something he would really regret." Looking out over his farmland, Jed noticed how peaceful it all was. The blue skies seemed to stretch on forever, filled with fluffy clouds that hovered over acres and acres of cultivated land. Where the farming stopped and the trees began, a woodpecker sent a rattle across the hillsides as he worked at the bark. The hound dog he had purchased to replace Boomer was trotting off behind the barn, busy checking over the property despite her steadily swelling belly. The farm was a wonderful place, but it couldn't keep away the conflict the people brought with them. When Jed didn't respond, Dale continued, "I came to tell you because I think this is a little worse than normal for Harvey. I was thinking Abby might be able to come talk some sense into him." Jed looked at his friend out of the corner of his eye. "I'm not so sure about that. Harvey was awfully mad when he found out Abby and I got married. I don't know that he would listen to her." The bearded man shrugged. "I don't know your wife very well, but she seems like a sweet woman. Besides, a pretty lady has a better chance of getting a man to cooperate. Well, she's not in a very talkative mood lately." Jed didn't want to go into the details, but there was no other way to get around this. It might not be a good idea for either Harvey or Abby. Dale grinned, a split in his bushy beard. "Trouble in paradise?" Waving away the idea, Jed replied, "No, I wouldn't say that. She's just having some trouble adjusting to life out here is all. She needs a little time to herself." His friend nodded knowingly. "Don't forget that I was married once, Jed. I miss my Elizabeth something fierce, but I remember how women can be. Why, one time she got so mad at me that she took my supper and fed it to the hog. The funny thing is, I don't even remember what I did wrong." He let out a big belly laugh that echoed across the surrounding valley. Jed couldn't help but smile. You might not have ever known Dale. Women are strange creatures. Sobering, Dale agreed. They are, but they sure make life pleasant when they want to. You hang in there, and everything will come to rights again. He stood and headed back to his wagon. "Let me know if you change your mind about Harvey. I've got to get into town and back before dark, so I'll see you later." Jed remained on the stump for a few minutes, watching Dale's wagon progress back down to the main road. Maybe his friend was right, and Abby would come around. In the meantime, he wasn't going to make things worse by insisting that she go into town and talk to Harvey. Jed could only imagine what that would do to his dear wife's mood, and he doubted that she would cooperate anyway. With a sigh, Jed climbed back up the ladder and resumed his work. Chapter 10. With Jed out from underfoot, Abby set herself to getting his brothers straightened out. Out of all the Rushers, Jed was the only one who had a few manners and knew how to speak cordially, so at least she didn't need to change that. But he had proved himself to be completely discourteous when it came to her, and she wasn't ready to tackle that just yet. The younger boys would be easier to mold. They were shocked when they got up the morning after her argument with Jed and found her waiting at the breakfast table with a wooden spoon in her hand. As they sat down for breakfast, she stopped them from eating until she had inspected their fingernails. "Go wash up," she admonished Jeremiah with a slap of the wooden spoon. "You aren't touching any food on this table until you stop living like you were raised in a barnyard." Josiah shrugged. "Well, we were raised in a barnyard." Abby rolled her eyes toward the ceiling and prayed for patience. "Then you need to pretend you were raised in a proper house if you want any of your breakfast." Once this part of the inspection was over, Abby began working on the next rules. She sat down in her seat but didn't take any food for herself, watching the boys instead. Don't just grab the platter, ask Joshua to pass it to you. Stop talking with your mouth full. Use your fork, not your fingers. Abby felt like she was raising a bunch of children instead of a group of men who were grown or nearly so. They watched her with wary eyes and did their best, but she would never take this lot out into public if they didn't start behaving like civilized people. Jed watched the farce with curiosity, but he didn't butt in. Abby was grateful. She didn't want to have to put him in his place in front of his brothers, but she would if it was necessary. Instead, her husband politely cleaned his plate and excused himself to go do his chores. When the rest of the Rusher clan tried to rise from the table and file out of the house, Abby barred the door with her wooden spoon. "Oh, no, you don't." "We have chores to do," Jeremiah whined. "I'm well aware of that." Abby kept her voice firm. She knew that this was only barely working on the young men. "But there are an awful lot of dishes on that table. I don't expect you boys to do everything in the kitchen, but you can't expect me to clean up that mess by myself, either. You'll take turns each day helping me clear the table, and nobody is leaving until you all push in your chairs." Stunned, the boys stared at her for a moment before shuffling back into the dining room and doing as they were told. "Josiah should go first on clearing the table," Jeremiah offered. "He's the one who made the biggest mess." "I did not," his older brother argued. "You're the one who left biscuit crumbs all over the floor." Unhappy that they were arguing, but pleased that they at least were aware of how untidy they had been, Abby rapped her spoon against the table to stop the argument. "Jeremiah, you will go first since you were generous enough to volunteer your brother." "But I don't want to hear it. I've told you how it's going to be, and that's that. Now start getting this table fixed up, and the rest of you clear out of here until it's time for lunch." Abby watched with satisfaction as the rest of the Rushers scrambled out the door as fast as they could before she could assign them any more duties. No doubt they had plenty of work to do around the farm, but that didn't mean they couldn't help out with the house a little. A couple of days in, they seemed to have the dish rotation down pat. Josiah didn't argue when it was his turn, but quietly brought the plates and platters to the kitchen without being told. Jonathan, even though he had been out hunting during the initial confrontation, caught on quickly and even wiped the table down before he melted back into the woods. Soon enough, Abby would have them wiping their boots before they came in the house and wearing clean shirts every day. Just a little higher. Abby directed Josiah one afternoon. She had found a set of curtains in the back of the linen cupboard and had washed and ironed them. When she discovered she had no way to hang them, she enlisted the handiest of the boys. "Now bring the left side up." "There. Perfect." At her feet, Boomer lifted his head at the banging of Josiah's hammer and then flopped back down on the floor. Josiah fixed the curtains in place and stepped back next to Abby to look at them. "They're nice, I guess, but I don't see why we need them." Abby shook her head at his ignorance. "Well, for one thing, they help keep the heat in when it's cold out, and they also help the house stay cooler during the warm months." Josiah raised an eyebrow. "Seems to me like if you wanted to block off the windows, you could have just left all the dirt on them. And then you wouldn't have seen all the dirt in the house either." Glowering at him, Abby considered fetching her spoon and smacking him soundly. She had spent an entire afternoon getting those windows clean, and it was nice to be able to look out over the kitchen sink and see the surrounding farmland while she scrubbed the dishes. "Things should be clean, Josiah. It's just how it is." She wondered if he was just giving her a hard time. Josiah had been the one who had helped her out the most around the house. "If you say so." He picked up his hammer and held it at the ready. "Anything else you need, boss?" Abby knew he was teasing her now, but she appreciated his willingness to help. Josiah seemed to enjoy having something to do with his hands, and together they had made a big difference to the interior of the house. Josiah had not only hung the curtains but also fixed a crooked shelf, repaired a table leg, and helped Abby drag the furniture out so she could clean behind and underneath it. Between what they had done and the steady improvements being done outside by Jed, the place was becoming almost livable. "Yes, actually, I think there's a leak in the roof." She had noticed it the night before while she was cooking supper when a steady cold drip kept falling on the back of her head. Abby had placed a bucket under it for the moment, but she had added it to her mental list of things that needed mending. Josiah scratched his head. "I don't mind doing it, but if you want the roof done right, you really ought to talk to John." "Oh." Abby hadn't seen as much of John, as he was always out in the barn working on some mysterious project or another. She supposed it would be fair to ask the other boys to help her with home repairs, but Josiah had been the easiest one to catch. "Yeah," Josiah replied enthusiastically. "He knows a lot about that sort of thing, and he has some really good ideas for improving the entire roof." Her curiosity piqued. Abby looked up at the ceiling. It looked like the corner of the kitchen wasn't the only spot that could use a little work. "Go get him for me, will you?" Josiah returned in short order with his brother, who wore a cross look on his face. "I'm busy. If you don't mind, He protested as his sibling dragged him through the door. "I'm sorry to disturb you, John," Abby explained, "but there's a leak in the roof, and Josiah said you were the person to talk to." The irritation in John's eyes was quickly replaced by a spark of interest. "Yeah. Well, I do have some good ideas." Abby sat down in one of the living room chairs, allowing her feet a moment to rest, and gestured for the boys to join her. "Tell me about them." Hesitantly, John and Josiah sat down as well. Abby was always after them to work, and it was no wonder that they gave pause before accepting her invitation. Well, John began, "this roof was constructed from untreated timbers. That was fine at the time because that was the only thing around. But that wet wood is mighty heavy, and it has weighed down the rest of the house, not to mention the fact that it's rotting in places. I propose ripping the whole thing off and making a new roof out of lighter wood that has been kiln-dried. Then we can seal it with tar to make it waterproof. It would take some time and money, but I think it would hold up for a long time." Abby raised her eyebrows, surprised at how much he had thought this through. "That's impressive. What's stopping you from doing this? It's obvious that the current roof isn't holding up." She gestured above her. The two brothers looked at each other. "Jed said we couldn't tear the whole house apart," Josiah explained. "He said it would make too much of a mess and cost too much money." Further surprised by the fact that Jed could stop the boys from doing something with only a word, Abby had yet to lose her interest. "I can see that it would be a lot of trouble to replace the whole thing, but couldn't you do it a section at a time?" She asked John. "You and Josiah would have to dedicate yourself to the roof until it was complete, and the other boys would have to take over your chores, but it would keep the whole building from being exposed to the elements all at once." John pursed his lips as he considered this. "That makes a lot of sense. But what about the money? It won't be cheap to have all that kiln, dried wood brought up from a lumber yard. Then we'll have to tar it and recover it. I don't think Jed's going to go for all of that." "That's not a problem." Abby felt a sudden sense of excitement taking over. She had begrudgingly tackled the idea of fixing up the house and the boys, but it had seemed like a futile effort at first. Now she saw that she really could make a difference. "I have some savings from when I was working down in Georgia. The inn paid well, but I didn't really need the money." John still looked dubious. "I don't know. Jed wouldn't want you to do that." Abby flicked her fingers in the air. "He'll just have to deal with it, won't he? It's either that or wake up and find ourselves crushed by the house." Josiah laughed at her joke, but John was still deep in thought. "You know, there are a few other things I've been wanting to do around here. They wouldn't take as much time or money, and they wouldn't involve tearing the roof apart. Maybe we could warm Jed up with a few of those first." Twisting up her mouth as she contemplated whether or not the roof would hold up through another winter, Abby bade him to go on. John explained the ideas he had for making the hearth more efficient, building a better fence that would keep the cattle in once and for all, and even some ideas for indoor plumbing. "Those sound wonderful," Abby exclaimed, clapping her hands. "How did you figure all this out?" John stood up and crossed the room to a heavily laden bookshelf. He pulled down several volumes and brought them back to Abby. "Judah is the big reader in the family, but I'm happy to read a book if there's something I can learn from it. Besides, reading a little bit seems to inspire my brain. A lot of it I figured out on my own." Abby glanced around for her reading glasses, but they didn't seem to be anywhere close at hand. Instead, she squinted at the titles on the tomes John handed her. They addressed things such as physics, engineering, and farm economy. "You're a lot more than just a backwoods farmer," she marveled. "I don't understand why you haven't done any of this yet." "Like I said, Jed didn't want us to," Josiah volunteered. "But these are big improvements," Abby argued, "and they wouldn't tear up the house like the roof would. Surely they wouldn't cost as much, either." "Jed said no," Josiah confirmed. Abby looked from one brother to the other. "Don't take this the wrong way, but I'm surprised that Jed has that much control over you. Do all of you boys listen to what he says?" "Of course." Josiah propped his feet up on the coffee table and put them back down again to avoid a swat from his sister-in-law. Otherwise, we would have all run wild. Our parents have been gone for a long time, and it was up to Jed to raise us. He had just been making plans to move out here, and he put it off for 8 years and then brought us all with him. Oh. Abby had no idea that it had been like that. It made sense now that Josiah said it, but she hadn't given any thought to how Jed's life might have been up to this point. Considering that he was but a single man, taking care of 6 boys must have been a daunting task. The Rusher boys were a bit wild and crude, but they weren't complete brutes. Abby never felt unsafe around them, and she knew she could trust them. She felt her anger at Jed shifting into something else. "But I'm sure that if you mention those ideas to him, he'll go for it," Josiah said exuberantly. "He'll listen to you." Abby put a finger to her lip as she considered this. She and Jed had gotten along wonderfully during their time in Sacramento and Woodland, but things had changed considerably since they had been at the farm. She had been angry with him, and had been justifiably so, but he probably wasn't too happy with her right now. He had been sleeping in the barn for days, and had only come in the house long enough to get a bite to eat. A few times he had tried to speak to her, and she had turned away. She hadn't been all that fair to him either, and even though he had deserved it, he wasn't likely to listen to any ideas she had about the house. Maybe. "I think we might need to give it a little time, though." Abby chewed her lip. Had the boys noticed that she and Jed weren't on speaking terms? Or did they even know what a marriage was supposed to be like? You could tell him anything, and he would jump for it, Josiah argued. "I don't think I've ever seen him as happy as he was when he rode up the driveway with you, next to him in the wagon." This caught Abby off. Gosh, had she been ignoring Jed's feelings? Really? John nodded his agreement. "Definitely. He's always been a pretty happy man, but I thought he might float right up to the clouds when he brought you home." Abby didn't know what to say. She wasn't going to discuss her relationship with Jed any further in front of the boys, but it was plain that they had noticed something she hadn't. Still, her husband should have been honest with her about his living situation. Abby might never have left Georgia if she had known she would be taking care of the entire family. Well, we'll just have to see. Chapter 11. Jed declined to let any of his brothers accompany him to town the next week. Nor did he offer to let Abby ride with him. He often enjoyed the company on long trips, but he needed some time to be alone. Granted, he had plenty of time alone in the barn every night, but this was different. He wanted to be out on the open road so he could think. Something had to be done about Abby. She had warmed up to him a little over the last few days, but their rapport had yet to return to its original state. When he came into the house for a change of clothing, she didn't skitter off into another room and hide from him until he left, from him until he left. Once or twice at the dining table, he caught her looking at him. Perhaps she was coming around, but it was moving a little slowly for his taste. He was ready to sleep in his own bed again, and preferably with his wife beside him. Stopping in at the saloon first thing, Jed greeted the barkeep. "It's a warm one out there today, Thomas." The bald man slid a sarsaparilla across the bar toward his customer. "Right you are, but it keeps me busy, so I don't mind." He paused for a moment as though deciding what to say, "and I believe there's been a full moon as well." "Oh." Jed took a sip of the refreshing drink, letting it slide down his throat. The only thing better was cold water straight out of the well. "Been having some brawls around here?" Thomas twisted the end of his mustache and looked at Jed seriously. "A lot more than I would like, I'm afraid, and most of them have been started by Harvey." Jed ran a hand through his hair. He had hoped that during this trip to Woodland he could stay out of Harvey's way and maybe not even have to hear about the man. He wasn't meant to be so lucky. "I heard that things have gotten worse." The barkeep looked around at the other customers in the bar, but they weren't paying attention. Jed guessed that whatever information he was about to receive was well known by the other folks in town anyway. "Harvey has landed himself in jail," Thomas whispered. "I heard about that," Jed said with a nod as he took another drink. "Dale told me he injured someone last week." Thomas negated this with a sweep of his hand. "No, not that. He managed to bail himself out, but now he's done it again. This time he decided to pick a fight with Adam Sisney, the blacksmith. Well, of course it was one heck of riot, with Harvey being drunk as a skunk and Sisney being the big brute that he is. They had it out for a while, and then the law showed up. That should have been the end of it. It always has been before. But Harvey turned on the sheriff and cut him up real good. Harvey just might hang for it this time." Jed closed his eyes and took a deep breath, repeating to himself that Harvey Kirkman was not his problem. It didn't matter that Abby had been married to the man's brother. There were no legitimate ties now that Ben was dead. But he still felt as though some of this was his fault. Harvey wouldn't have been causing this much trouble if Jed hadn't brought Abby here and married her. "What am I supposed to do?" he asked. "That's up to you," the barkeep replied. "If it were up to me, I think I'd just leave the situation alone." Even before this to-do with the sheriff, Harvey had been going around town acting like a crazy man. He was threatening people, even random strangers he saw on the street, and he was hardly ever sober. Every time I tried to cut him off, he would try to start a fight. Sometimes he was successful and sometimes not, but he definitely was that night he hurt the sheriff. When Jed left the saloon, he had to drive past the sheriff's office to get to the general store. He felt conflicted as he passed the building, torn between ignoring the situation and trying to do something about it. He knew that he could never change the man Harvey was, nor could he convince him that there was nothing wrong with his own marriage to Abby. Well, there was plenty wrong, but none of it was Harvey's concern. At the very least, he could stop in and see how the sheriff was feeling, but that would imply that he was involved. No, Jed had better things to do with his time than get tangled up in Harvey's antics. Jed had enough on his hands with a farm to run, 6 unruly brothers, and a wife who didn't want to have anything to do with him. Instead, he moved on down to the general store to get the supplies he needed. Stepping up to the counter, Jed pulled a folded sheet of paper from his pocket. He had managed to speak to Abby long enough to get a list of what she needed for the kitchen. In addition to his usual order of flour, sugar, and coffee, there were all sorts of things he had never purchased before: baking soda, vinegar, cinnamon, needles, and thread. Monroe looked up at him over his wire frames. "It's good to see you, Jed. Everything going okay up your way?" Jed said that it was, but he couldn't quite shake the uneasy feeling that the conversation with Thomas had given him. It was as though he had something on his shoulder that he couldn't flick away, and it felt as though everyone had stopped to look at him as he came through town. The clerk's words had been friendly, but Jed thought there was a hint of worry in his voice. I suppose you've heard about Harvey." Monroe leaned his elbows on the counter. The store wasn't busy at the moment, and the older man was content to chat for a moment before he started collecting Jed's order. "It's quite a shame." "It is," Jed admitted. "Thomas told me. I knew he was a brawler, but I never thought it would be that bad." Monroe glanced out the window as a man walked by. "But it is. He's got everyone looking over their shoulders. Harvey came in here the morning before he got arrested, stinking of whiskey. He ran everyone else out of the place, but there wasn't anything I could do about it. If I had kicked him out, he would have turned on me next." Jed's stomach sank down into his boots. What could he do? Harvey was terrorizing the town. "I hate that, Monroe. But at least he's behind bars now. He can't hurt anybody else." The clerk lifted a shoulder. "That's true, but the sheriff isn't too happy with him. He's got a little time before anything further happens, since the judge isn't in town right now, but I wouldn't be surprised to find him heading for the scaffold." "Maybe not," Jed said hopefully. "Maybe they'll find something else they can do with him. Run him out of town or something." Monroe wasn't so sure. You know Harvey. Nothing will stop him once he sets his mind. What about Abby? Maybe she can go talk to him, or talk to the sheriff on his behalf. Once more, Jed was taken back in his mind to the day of his wedding. Harvey had intruded on their special day and made Abby feel guilty and uncertain. Now that he thought about it, it wouldn't be a surprise if he discovered that it was that event which changed her attitude toward Jed so much. It wasn't right that a man should make her feel that way, and the sadness that Harvey's arrest had caused inside him quickly boiled up into anger. No way. She doesn't need the stress of getting involved. Monroe nodded his understanding. "I'm sure that's true, but there's nobody else around here who knows him. You don't think she might be able to get him under control?" Jed eyed the clerk levelly. "Monroe, you know how my brothers are. Think about that poor wife of mine up there on the hill trying to keep them in check as well as keep up with the house. Why, it's more than any woman ought to be expected to handle on her own. Now everyone wants her to handle Harvey as well, a man who believes she ought to be spending the rest of her life wallowing in grief." With no further arguments to make against that statement, Monroe went about collecting Jed's order. Left to himself to wait, Jed realized just how true his own words had been. He had asked an awful lot of Abby. He had written in his very first letter to her that living with him would require a lot of hard work. But he hadn't explained that she would have a ready-made family once she arrived. It had probably taken its toll on her, and the surprise was not a welcome one. He could have smacked himself in the forehead if he didn't think someone might see him. Jed had been able to figure out what was wrong with his wife, and the answer had been right in front of him. Chapter 12. Abby peered through the kitchen window when she heard the rattling of the wagon in the yard. Jed had returned from the market, his wagon laden with goods. She had thought at first that she was glad to see him go into town. If he wasn't on the farm, then she didn't have to work to avoid him. But once the wagon had gone down the long driveway and disappeared down the road, she felt an unexplainable sadness settle on her shoulders. She had so wanted her marriage to Jed to be a happy one. That was never going to happen if he didn't realize what he had done wrong, apologize, and come sleep in the house again. Of course, Jed wouldn't do that if he didn't know what he had done wrong in the first place. Grumbling to herself about how dense men could be sometimes, Abby wiped her hands on her apron and headed out to the barnyard. She had rehearsed the lines she was going to say over and over again, but the closer she got to her husband, the more nervous she felt about telling him everything that had been on her mind. The past couple of weeks had given her a lot of time to think, and perhaps it had been too much time. Jed looked up in surprise when he saw his wife approaching, but he continued with his work. He had picked up several bags of oats on his trip into town, and he was stacking them just inside the barn. "Do you have a moment?" Abby asked gently. She hadn't really spoken to her husband since they had first arrived at the farm. Giving him a list of items she needed from the store didn't count. Of course. Jed had a sheen of sweat on his forehead from his work, and he swiped at it with the back of his hand. He was a big man, a strong one, and Abby had failed to see any of his positive attributes once she had grown angry with him. Now she could once again see why she had fallen for him on that train platform in Sacramento. Abby looked at the side of the barn, at the hard-packed ground under her feet, at the fat hound retreating into the shade from the big building, at anything but her husband. While he had been the wrong one in the first place, the way she reacted hadn't been completely right. "I want to talk to you about us. About how I feel." She cringed, waiting for Jed to tell her that he didn't have time to listen to a woman whining. Instead, he fished a jug of water out from under the seat of the wagon, took a hearty gulp, and nodded his head. "I'm listening. When we met and we got married, I had no reason to believe that this house would be occupied by anyone but the two of us. You never said anything about your brothers. I understand that they are simply part of your life, and I have come to know them much better over the last couple of weeks, but I still feel that it was something I should have known about. It made me feel as though you had tricked me into coming here to be a servant for your family." Abby could only hope that her little speech wouldn't make him angry. He had no right to be, but that didn't mean he wouldn't. Jed could easily tell her to gather her things and get in the wagon so he could put her on the train. But he bobbed his head slightly. "I can see that." Abby took this as a sign to go on. He wasn't arguing, and that had to be good. "I know that I should have told you all this in the first place. It might have saved us both a lot of heartache, whatever the outcome. But I was angry and hurt and lost. I didn't really know what else to do, and at the time it seemed best to just clam up and ignore you. At the very least, it kept me from saying something I might regret." She looked at him now. Jed was staring at his boots, but she could tell he was listening. Finally, he met her gaze. "Abby, A sharp yelp interrupted him, and Jed turned to look for its source. Seeing nothing in the immediate vicinity, he peered into the dimness of the barn. "Lucy's having her puppies," he exclaimed. "Who?" Abby asked as she rushed in through the barn door. "Lucy." The dog? I had no idea she was so close to her time. Jed was bent down just inside one of the stalls, his big hands caressing the hound's head gently. "We've got to find the other Joan." Abby was briefly frozen in place by the sweetness her husband showed to the poor dog. He ran his fingers over her head and rubbed her ears, doing his best to comfort her even though he wasn't sure what else to do. She wanted to stand there in the barn doorway and just watch him. But there was no time. Abby turned and ran for the house. Whatever Jed had been about to say to her would have to wait until later. Chapter 13. Jed didn't like feeling helpless, but he had never been the one to handle these situations. It had always been Jonathan. He was a hunter and a trapper, but he knew animals better than he knew people. He had pulled calves who refused to be born and eased horses who couldn't be calmed by anyone else. Even from a young age, the red-headed brother could often be found in the barn, assisting in the birth of a litter of puppies or kittens. As he waited for Abby to return, hopefully, with the other Joan in tow, Jed reflected on what Abby had told him. What he had suspected had been true, and he had tricked himself into not seeing it. Her grievances were reasonable, and though he couldn't change the fact that he had so many siblings, he could at least apologize to her. The two of them would definitely need to find some time to talk, and Jed could only hope that she would be as open as she had been a few moments ago. Lucy whined again, bringing Jed's attention back to the matter at hand. The dog lay on her side, panting and staring up at Jed with fear in her eyes. The collie mix had been a purchase from a nearby farm when Jed had realized Boomer wasn't keeping up anymore, and Jed had admired her for her tricolor coat and sharp eyes. She had already chased several predators away from the chicken coop, and he didn't doubt that her constant baying kept other wildlife from coming too close to the barnyard. "It's going to be all right," he said softly, speaking both to the dog and to himself. Footsteps in the doorway made him turn, but it was only Abby. Her hands were bunched in her apron where she had picked up her skirts to run, and her chest heaved from the effort. A sheen of sweat covered her forehead. "I can't find him," she explained as she rushed forward. "I asked the other boys, but nobody has seen him all day." "But I need him," Jed protested. "I don't know what else to do." Abby knelt down in the straw next to him, unconcerned with getting her clothing dirty. "I don't either, so I guess we'll just do the best we can." She pulled several clean rags from the pocket of her apron and handed a few of them to Jed. The hound whimpered as a contraction made a wave down her side, and Jed pulled his hands away from her in surprise. He didn't want to hurt her, but he didn't know how to help her either. Abby, however, had completely taken over the situation. "I can see the head of the first one," she exclaimed. "Come on, Lucy. You can do it. That's a good girl." Soon enough, the new mother was cleaning off her first baby. "Wow," Jed breathed as he looked down at the furry blob. It was already rooting around near its mother's belly, expecting its first meal before she had even finished with her labor. The tiny thing was black and white, with a perfectly round dot of brown in the middle of its back. "Here comes another one," Abby announced. She monitored Lucy's progress, but Jed noticed that she had yet to do anything but pet the dog comfortingly. "Should we be doing something?" Jed asked nervously. He had never helped Jonathan before with this process, and he wished now that he had at least watched from a distance. Abby didn't take her eyes off the hound to reply to him. She seems to be doing just fine, and I'm sure she knows a lot more about whelping puppies than we do. Besides, I don't want to scare her by picking up the puppies. She doesn't know me that well, and she might think I'm taking them away. She reached out and stroked Lucy's back as another ripple contracted her body. At least she picked a nice spot. "There's plenty of clean straw in here, and it will be nice and cool during the day." Jed looked up at the dog's surroundings. This stall was the biggest one in the barn, and it normally belonged to his favorite horse, Thunderbolt. With a half smile, he realized that Lucy would be the new tenant for a while. The second puppy had arrived, this one almost completely white. It had little freckles of black and brown scattered across its back. Lucy pulled and tugged at the sack that surrounded it. Abby watched attentively, but she kept her hands folded in her lap. Just as Lucy was getting the newest puppy cleaned off, another one came. Oh, and here's another one right behind it. No longer able to sit idly by, she reached forward and began cleaning the newest puppies. Lucy helped, licking at her newborns and occasionally licking Abby's hand as well. "I think she knows you're helping," Jed said softly. He couldn't believe how amazing this woman was. She had jumped into the work of running a household with 7 men from the moment she had arrived, and already he could see a massive difference in the way the place looked and smelled. It had inspired him to do more of the work he should have done long ago, and somehow Abby had even convinced his rowdy brothers to do their share. Now claiming to have never done such a thing before, she had taken command of a young mother hound and her brood, staying out of the way when she needed to and taking action when it seemed necessary. "They need to breathe," Abby explained, "and I don't think Lucy can quite keep up with them." A fifth puppy arrived, but it didn't move, and Abby scooped it out of the straw with a rag. She used another one of her rags to clean the sack away from the little creature, wiping fluids gently away from its nose and eyes. Laying one hand on top of its tiny back, her eyes widened in alarm. "It isn't breathing." "Oh, I'm sorry, Lucy." Jed reached out and touched the top of the dog's head. "No." Abby held an ear down to the pup's back, then straightened and rubbed the little animal vigorously between her hands. "What are you doing?" Jed asked, astonished. It seemed like a rough way to handle a newborn puppy, breathing or not. "I've seen this somewhere," she explained distractedly as she listened for any signs of breathing once again. "They don't start breathing until Lucy licks them, and she's not gentle about it." She rubbed again and then cried out in pleasure and surprise. She set the baby down next to its mother. Lucy sniffed it intently, licked the top of its head, and then lay back to let the little one find its meal. "You did it!" Jed couldn't believe what he had just seen. This pup, almost completely black, had gone from still and lifeless to a squirming ball of fur. "That's amazing. Are you sure you've never done this before?" Abby wiped her hands on a rag, a beatific smile on her face. She was proud of what she had done, and so she deserved to be. If it had been up to him, Lucy's puppy might not have made it. Abby tipped her head to the side, allowing herself one brilliant glance at her husband before she returned her attention to the belabored mother. "I haven't," Abby promised. "It just seemed like the thing to do." Another baby was on its way, and since the pups already born had all been cleaned off, Abby let Lucy do what came naturally to her. Several hours later, when Jed's knees ached from crouching in the straw for so long, Lucy had 10 little puppies. She squeezed her eyes in bliss as they nursed. Abby, once again beating Jed to doing what was necessary, fetched bowls of water and food for the new mother. As she set them down near Lucy's head, the dog laid a heavy paw on Abby's hand, pinning it to the straw. The hound leaned forward and licked Abby's fingers thoroughly, giving them as good of a bath as she had any of her puppies. Jed could have kicked himself. The dog had come to know Abby better in the span of a few hours than he had in 2 weeks. The sound of booted feet pounding across the barnyard brought their attention away from the scene in front of them. The other Joan burst into the barn, his eyes wild as they looked around for Lucy. Bits of leaves and sticks clung to his clothing and hair, and he had smears of dirt on his cheeks. "Is she all right? I came as soon as I heard, but I was way out on the property line. It took Jeremiah a long time to find me." "They're fine, Jonathan," Abby assured him. "Lucy did a wonderful job, and she has 10 little babies to take care of. Come and see." Jed didn't miss the look of appreciation his brother gave to his wife for calling him by his real name. Jonathan had been the other John for such a long time that he never thought about the phrase anymore, but Abby had once again been more attentive than he had. Yes, they would have to find some time to continue their talk. Meanwhile, it was getting dark, and he still had plenty of chores to finish. Chapter 14. Supper was late that night. Abby would have started it much earlier, but of course she had been well occupied in the barn. She had dashed back inside to clean up and make the quickest meal she could come up with, lest the Rusher clan starve to death for the sake of a hound and her puppies. Now that the dishes had all been cleared away with Joshua's help, Abby sat next to the hearth in a rocking chair, her feet propped up on a stool. It had been a long, hard day, as all of them were, but she felt she deserved a little bit of a break. First, she'd had to find her glasses, which always seemed to grow legs and walk off on their own. She searched the kitchen and bedroom before finding them on the coffee table. Finally, she was ready to relax. For the first time since she had come to California, she pulled out her cross. Stitch. The design she had been sewing was a spray of various flowers topped with a bluebird. She had started it in her free time back in Georgia, between the time she got home from the inn and when she finally felt tired enough to go to bed. Abby found the process relaxing as she dipped her needle in and out of the taut fabric on a hoop, the pattern slowly coming to life with each stitch. It was a hobby that also felt practical and productive, as she had made pillowcases, bookmarks, and quilt squares, which suited her just fine. Smiling to herself as she created a new petal on a rose, Abby thought back to her time in the barn with Jed and Lucy. She hadn't spent that much time with her husband since their wedding, and it was nice to be able to just be together in the same room without sparks of tension flying between them. They'd had something more important to concentrate on, and it gave Abby hope that they would be able to continue their conversation once he came in from the barn. The dog had taken up the majority of the afternoon, and Jed still wanted to get the wagon unloaded and the livestock tended before he sat down to his supper. Her smile increasing, Abby wondered if he might stay in the house for a little while, once his meal was done. The sound of the front door creaking open made her heart leap up in her chest, and Abby set her sewing in her lap before she stabbed herself with the needle. "Jed?" "No, it's just me." Jeremiah came in the room without his usual radiance. Instead of strutting in with a bounce in his step and a command for all the attention in the place, he slunk in with worried eyes. He stood across the room from his sister-in-law, as though afraid to approach. "What's the matter?" Abby's mind instantly went to the puppies. If something had happened to them, she wouldn't forgive herself for not moving Lucy and her brood into the house. Jeremiah looked around to make sure nobody else was listening. The rest of the boys were finishing their evening chores or playing dice on the back porch. "Nothing. Well, not really. I just wanted to talk to you for a minute." Her concern growing, Abby gestured to a nearby chair. "Of course." "I'm all ears." The youngest Rusher sat, then stood up again and paced in front of the fireplace. "I heard a rumor," he began, "and mind you, I don't know how much truth there is in it. I think it is true, but I don't really have any proof. And I don't want to be the kind of guy who goes around spreading hearsay like it's the gospel, because that might get folks in trouble." Abby smiled. Jeremiah could ramble just as much as his oldest brother could when he was nervous. "Just tell me what it is. We'll figure it all out from there." He sat down again, but only on the very edge of the seat. "I heard that Harvey Kirkman is in jail, and this isn't the first time that it's happened lately. But he's gotten himself into some real trouble this time, not just fighting and carrying on, and he's going to hang." Now it was Abby's turn to be on the edge of her seat. Her cross-stitch dropped to the floor, but she paid it no attention. "Are you sure?" Jeremiah fidgeted. "Like I said, I don't have any way to prove it. But I heard Jed talking it over with Jonathan earlier behind the barn. They didn't know I was listening, and I doubt they would have told me anything if I had asked. They both think that just because I'm the youngest, I don't need to know about those things. But I'm just as much of a man as either one of them." He stuck out his chin defiantly. "Jed knows about this." Abby's heart was thudding so hard in her ears, she could barely hear Jeremiah's affirmative answer. "Why hasn't he told me, or done anything about it?" The young man looked uncomfortable. I don't know all of that. The only thing I heard was that if nobody steps forward to vouch for Harvey, he'll be swinging before sunrise. Sorry, I shouldn't have said it like that. But Jed said he wasn't going to get involved. Abby jumped up from her chair, pausing just long enough to pick her embroidery hoop up off the floor and set it back in her sewing basket. Where's Jed right now? Her mind raced with all the possibilities. Jed had likely heard of the incident the last time he rode into town, which made sense. Everyone in Woodland knew that he had a tie to Harvey through his new wife, and Jed was the kind of man other folks looked up to. It seemed likely that they would tell him in the hopes that he would do something about it. But why didn't he? Why hadn't Jed even just told her what was going on? Was he jealous of her late husband, doing his best to keep her away from any part of her past? Jeremiah watched his sister-in-law cautiously. I believe he's out in the back pasture. There was a small section of fence out that way that needed mending, and he said it couldn't wait until tomorrow. Good. Abby charged across the room toward her bedroom. Let's hope he stays there long enough. She slammed open the bedroom door and grabbed a small traveling bag from the corner. What are you doing? Jeremiah asked hesitantly from the doorway. Abby snatched up a few things, threw them in the bag, and then marched into the kitchen for other provisions, pushing Jeremiah out of her way as she did so. You don't want me to answer that, unless you plan on telling Jed the truth. He followed her to the kitchen and stood in the doorway, his palms on either side of the doorframe as he watched her stash a few biscuits and apples in her bag. I take it that means he isn't going to like it. Yanking the drawstring on the bag shut, Abby looked Jeremiah square in the eye. Well, you can ask him how he feels about his wife riding through the dark into town to free her rogue ex-brother-in-law. You might know him better than I do, but I'm pretty sure he isn't going to like it. She knew that Jed would have something to say if he had a chance to intervene, but this was something she needed to take care of. If Jed wouldn't or didn't want to do it, well then that was fine, but she couldn't just let it go. At least let me go with you, Jeremiah offered. Jed's going to be mad anyway, but he'll have my hide if he discovers I let you go alone. Then tell him the truth, Abby said as she made her way to the front door. Tell him I wouldn't let you go with me, because I'm not. This is something I need to do on my own. And if Jed doesn't want to be involved, then he won't want you to be either. Abby, please. Can we just wait a while? Maybe talk this over with Jed. I don't want you to do anything dangerous. And what if something happens to you out on the road? Jeremiah looked even more worried than he had when he had come in to talk to Abby in the first place. Sighing, Abby turned back toward the young man. He had done her a huge favor by telling her about Harvey in the first place, and it had put his relationship with Jed in jeopardy. She had only rewarded him by announcing her rash plans and speaking to him sharply. Jeremiah, I don't have time to talk about it, she said gently. A man's life hangs in the balance. But I appreciate everything you've done, and I promise I'll explain everything to Jed myself when I get back. She leaned up to plant a kiss on his cheek and headed out to the barn. Fortunately, she knew where Jed had moved his horse now that Lucy had taken its stall. Chapter 15. I think that about does it. Jed stood back to inspect the work he and John had done repairing the fence. It should hold at least until that bull decides he wants to go roaming the countryside again. John stood next to him, with his fingers pinched around his chin. You know, if we rebuild this a different way, we might not have to worry about the bull getting out ever again. Jed glanced at his brother and then back at the fence. The sun had sunk down below the hills, and everything was bathed in a deep shade of blue. They had been lucky to have just enough light to get the job done. Is this another one of your crazy schemes? It's not a scheme, John protested. It really would work. The fence would be taller and stronger. It would keep the animals in, and it wouldn't fall over every time the wind knocks a branch down on it. I don't know, Jed said with a shake of his head. It sounds like it'll cost a lot of money. John agreed. Yes, it will, but we're already spending money buying materials for all the repairs. In the long run, it will come out cheaper. But I can't come up with the money for a whole new fence overnight. There are more important things we need with what money we do have. Like a new roof. John raised a challenging eyebrow. It just so happens that Abby supports the idea. Jed ran a hand through his hair. He should have known Abby would be behind all this. She had made no secret of the changes she was making around the Rusher farm, and it was only a matter of time before they got big enough to involve him. I see. Well, it also just so happens that I need to go have a discussion with my wife. Maybe I'll bring it up. He picked up his tools and started walking up the hill toward the barn. John caught up with him quickly. Now, don't be mad at her, Jed. She only wants what's best for this place. I know you two haven't gotten along the best. Don't think that hasn't escaped our notice, but she's been working really hard. I told her about some of the ideas I had, and she thinks they're great. Smiling, Jed turned around and saw the hope on his brother's face. I'm sure she does. She always seems to know what's best. So, that means we can do it? John asked eagerly. That means we will discuss it, Jed laughed. Don't get too excited yet. Jed had a warm feeling in his chest as they made their way out of the pasture. Abby was elevating herself more and more in his eyes, even when they weren't in the same room or even on the same acre. He wondered just how much she had discussed with John, but he would find out soon enough. Jed had a good feeling that Abby was keeping his supper warm for him, and the two of them had the rest of the night to work out their differences. Hanging his tools in the barn, he peeked into the stall, where Lucy and her puppies now lived. The mother was sleeping peacefully in the corner, a pile of pups snuggled up next to her. Jed hoped that he and Abby could someday be as happy as Lucy was. It would start tonight, when he apologized to her. As he left the barn, he turned back around to peer down the long aisle. The light had faded fast with the sun, and he couldn't see much, but he could swear something was out of place. Shrugging and deciding he was just tired, he headed into the house. He expected things to be quiet this late into the evening, but he paused inside the front door when he noticed just how quiet it was. Joshua was asleep on the couch with his hat pulled over his eyes. The other boys were gathered on the back porch. Where was Abby? A faint clinking in the kitchen gave him the answer. I hope I didn't keep you waiting too long, he said as he swung open the door. I had a lot to do, but I can say that. Where's Abby? He had expected to find his wife at the sink, cleaning up the last few dishes or wiping down the flour canister. She probably thought he hadn't noticed, but Abby kept an immaculate kitchen. The person in the room, however, was definitely not her. You should really try this, Jeremiah said as he scraped a fork across a small plate. He was leaning against the sink and talking with his mouth full. Abby made the most amazing peach cobbler. There's still a little bit left. If you want it, you better eat it before I get my hands on it. The dessert sounded delicious, but Jed needed his wife. Who? Jeremiah turned around and put his plate in the sink. Who? Jed repeated. The only girl we have around here. Where's Abby? Jeremiah scratched the back of his head and looked down at the floor. Well, she's not exactly here right now. Growing impatient, Jed strode across the kitchen until he was nose to nose with his little brother. I can see that, he growled. So where is she? This was supposed to be a pleasant evening despite the late hour. He would have his meal, apologize to his wife, and finally get to sleep in his own bed again. Then he would spend the rest of his life trying to make up to Abby for being such a dolt. All of this was going to be hard to accomplish, however, if he couldn't find Abby in the first place. The young man sighed and rolled his eyes toward the ceiling. You know, we could really use a new roof. Jeremiah. Okay. He held out his palms to stave off his brother's attack. She went into town. I told her about Harvey being in jail, and she went to Woodland to save him. What? The zeal he'd had for the evening dissolved into fury. Why did you tell her? Why didn't you stop her? Why didn't you tell me? There were too many questions, and he needed answers to all of them instantly. Easy there, big brother. I tried to go with her, but she wouldn't let me. She said if you weren't going to do it, then she would do it on her own. He slapped his hand over his mouth as he realized how insulting that probably was to Jed. I did try, though. But why did you tell her? Jed demanded. I didn't want her to know because I didn't want her to worry. Harvey shouldn't be her problem. He paused, assessing another aspect of the situation. For that matter, how did you know? Once again, Jeremiah looked sheepish. I might have heard you telling the other John. And do you know why I did that? Jed cried as he threw his hands in the air in exasperation. Because I knew Jonathan would listen to what I had to say and give me a rational opinion about it. He wouldn't run off and tattle on me. Jeremiah looked ashamed. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have interfered, but I was just trying to help. I thought if Abby knew, then she could make her own decision. That wasn't up to you, Jed grumbled. I was trying to protect her. No offense, Jed, but there are some things you can't protect her from. She wants to help Harvey. Don't you think it's best to support her in that? Jed didn't appreciate getting advice from his youngest brother, especially when he was right. He had done the wrong thing by keeping Harvey's antics from her, but that didn't mean she should have gone off at night without him. She should have talked to him first. Ironically, none of this would have been a problem if he had been the one to speak up in the first place. I'm going into town to find her. How long ago did she leave? Jeremiah cast a glance at the clock. Less than an hour ago, I'd say. Right. Then I can probably still catch up to her. Thunderbolt is the fastest horse in the county. Jed grabbed a coat against the coolness of the night, which would only be increased as he sped down the road. About that. Jed closed his eyes and took a deep breath. What now? Well, I didn't get a good look, what with it being dark and all, but I think she might have taken him. Resisting the urge to beat his head against the door, Jed nodded. That explained why something seemed to be off in the barn, and he should have gone back and looked. It seemed that his life was full of should-haves lately. Fine. I'll just have to do my best. He slammed the door behind him and stomped out into the darkness. Chapter 16. Abby rode hard, using only starlight and a sliver of moon to guide her toward town. She was lucky that the route from Woodland to the Rusher farm was a fairly straightforward one. If it had been composed of too many turns and twists, she might not have been able to remember it. Thunderbolt was a huge horse, much bigger than she was used to riding. In Georgia, she'd always had shorter horses, the kind that made every single stride felt by their riders. Jed's horse had a big, loping gait that gobbled up the ground in front of him. Abby leaned forward over his neck to free his back and allow him to move however he needed to navigate the night. She trusted him to carry her safely. She reined up as she pulled into town, her teeth chattering. The air had grown much cooler now that the sun was down, and she wished she had grabbed a cloak before she'd run out of the house. Thunderbolt had a thick coating of foam on his withers, and she allowed him to walk for a bit to cool down. It didn't help her eagerness to get to Harvey, but she wouldn't be doing Jed any favors if she killed his horse. Abby hadn't been into Woodland in weeks, but it wasn't hard to locate the sheriff's office. The small town was organized along one main road, with all the important businesses standing shoulder to shoulder. The squat brick building that housed the county jail was right next to the courthouse in the center of town. Only one window was lit, and she held out hope that she wasn't too late. Tying Thunderbolt to the hitching post, Abby found that the door was locked. She knocked desperately on the heavy wood. Her prayers were answered when a burly man flung open the door and glowered down at her. His eyebrows raised for a moment at seeing a woman on his doorstep, but he recovered his dour attitude quickly. "What do you want?" "I'm here to see." Her voice was tiny, and even she could barely hear it. Abby cleared her throat. "I'm here to see Harvey Kirkman." The deputy tipped his head as he considered her. Abby doubted Harvey had many requests for visitors, if any at all. Finally, he stepped back to allow her inside. "Come in." "Thank you." Abby stepped inside. The one light she had seen through the window emanated from a lamp on a worn oak desk just inside the door. The paperwork scattered across its surface suggested the deputy had been sitting there until he got up to let her in. There were 2 more desks in the room, a coat rack on the wall, and a side table bearing a jug of water and several cups. "You say you're here for Harvey, eh?" the deputy asked. He was a big man with flaming red hair and a matching walrus mustache. Even taller than Jed, he had to look down his nose to see the newcomer. "He doesn't have much time left. The judge is going to be here first thing in the morning." Abby's stomach turned. There was even less time left for Harvey than she had realized. "I know, but I'm here to vouch for him. He's my former brother-in-law, and I think I might be able to talk some sense into him." The deputy looked dubious, but he shrugged his shoulders and led her to a doorway on the other side of the room. It opened up into a short hallway with cells on either side. "Suit yourself, but I can't say he's the most pleasant prisoner I've ever had in here. He spent the first 2 days straight yelling his head off." This did not surprise Abby. Harvey had never been the most stable man. He had always needed Ben to help him out with his finances, or bail him out when he got himself in trouble. Even in Georgia, he hadn't been the most upstanding citizen. But Abby knew that she could handle him. Besides, if he got too difficult, there would be bars between them. As she followed the deputy into the jail, she noticed that most of the cells were unoccupied. It must have been a slow month in Woodland. A man in the first cell on the left wore rags and a filthy hat, and Abby wondered if he was homeless. The next few were empty, and Harvey was in the very last one. "I put him back here so his hollering wouldn't be quite so annoying," the lawman explained. "But it didn't make much of a difference. He's calmed down a little bit, though." He banged on the bars to wake the sleeping man inside. The form under the woolen blanket stirred, stilled, and stirred again. "What?" he croaked. "There's someone here to see you," the deputy replied. "Considering how little time you have left, you might want to get up and talk." Harvey heaved himself into a seated position. His blonde hair stuck out on all sides of his head, and his face was red and wrinkled from sleep. "Who?" He blinked and focused on Abby. "Oh, you. That's no way to treat a lady," the deputy admonished. "Especially not in your position. I suggest you behave yourself or else I'll make her leave." He looked down at Abby. "I'll be up front. If you need me, just holler." He glanced at Harvey once more before lumbering back to his office. "What do you want?" her former brother-in-law demanded. "I came here to help." Though Harvey had never been Abby's favorite person, her heart went out to him. His clothes were filthy, and the stench of him easily drifted past the bars of his cell. The jail was cold, and the small bunk he had against the wall looked hard and uncomfortable. She sat down on a nearby bench. "I heard you've really done it this time." "What business of it is yours?" Harvey snarled. "You're too busy with your new husband to worry about me. You got over Ben awfully fast, if you ask me." Abby put her chin in her hand. She had only just begun, but it had already been an exhausting day. With Harvey's attitude, it wasn't going to end anytime soon. "You know that isn't true. I waited more than a respectable time before I even contemplated marrying again." "Sure." Harvey sat on the edge of his bunk and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Like I don't know what you were up to at that inn. You should have been at home, caring for my brother's house and grieving properly, but you wanted to flaunt yourself in front of all the locals instead. What better way to meet a man, right?" Abby put her fists on her hips. "If you had stayed around town for more than a few days, you would know that I didn't even meet Jed at the inn. It was something for me to do, to keep myself occupied instead of wallowing in sorrow." Harvey pointed an accusing finger at her. "You know what I think? I think you never loved Ben at all. You only married him because he had money, and he was in line to be the next vice president of the bank. You knew that being married to Ben would mean lots of nice dresses and a good place in society." "I did no such thing, Harvey Kirkman, and you should know better than that. Ben and I loved each other very much, and I was devastated when he died. I didn't know what to do with myself once I didn't have a husband to take care of, and that was why I took a job at the inn. Willow was kind enough to offer me a place, and I don't regret it for 1 second." Her voice was getting shrill, and she fought to get it under control again. Harvey didn't need to know that he was getting under her skin. But it was too late, and his bleary eyes met hers. I wonder what Ben would say about all that if he were here. Now Abby stood up and came to stand in front of the bars. She wasn't afraid of Harvey, and he needed to hear what she had to say. If Ben were here, he would be happy that I had moved on. Ben was a good man, but he was also a practical one. He would understand that I couldn't just stand still once he had gone on to heaven. Harvey shook his head. "He would be so disappointed in you, Abby. He would have wanted his wife to live her life more respectably, even if she didn't truly love him." "The only person he would be disappointed in is you," she countered. "Ben was always working so hard to help you live the straight life. He constantly gave you money when you had wasted yours on booze, and that was even before he had the job at the bank. Every time you started a fight with someone or dared to cross the law, he always had your back. Ben was there for you, and the best thing you could do for him right now would be to get yourself together and live the life he always wanted for you. He would be madder than a wet hen if either one of us had simply stopped living just because he had died." Abby had already had this argument with herself almost 2 years ago. She had debated whether it was the right thing to take the job at the inn, but she had known that Ben would want her to be happy. When it came to finding a new husband, she still knew the same thing to be true. Abby had to do what was best for her, and she had tried her best to do so. It had been a rocky road more recently, but she still had hope that it would work out for the best. The blond man's face had grown sad. His mouth turned down at the corners, and he stared at Abby's boots. "But I miss my brother," he said softly. "I don't know what to do with myself now that he isn't here. He was my anchor, and I've just been drifting around ever since. I thought coming to California would give me a new start, and I wouldn't have all those reminders of Ben, and I could just pretend it had only ever been me. But I can't, Abby. I just can't. She wrapped her hands around the bars, speaking earnestly. She wished that Harvey hadn't left so soon, and maybe they could have had this talk much earlier. She realized just how important it was to tell people what you thought or felt. Otherwise, they had no idea. I know how easy it is to base your life around a person, because life is all about people. Sometimes you find new ones, and sometimes you lose the ones you thought you would keep forever. That's why you must love them while you can. That's why I'm here, Harvey. I love you because you're Ben's. Brother and I want the same things for you that he would have. Harvey nodded, but he was still solemn. I appreciate it, Abby, but it's too late now. The judge is on his way from Sacramento, and I'm done for. Isn't there something I can do? Abby pleaded. Her thoughts went to Jed. He was going to be angry with her when he found out that she had come to the jailhouse. Abby couldn't offer to let Harvey stay with them, or he would be completely outraged. She wasn't certain it was the right solution anyway. She had a little bit of money, but she couldn't bribe a judge. Harvey met her eyes with his watery blue ones. You know what I could use, Abby. I just need someone to stay here with me for a little while. I've been so alone, and I could use the company. She smiled at him sadly. It was something so small, and yet she knew it meant the world to him. I'd be happy to, for as long as you need me. Abby settled herself back down on the bench. Harvey was quiet, and they were content to sit in silence together. He just needed to know that someone was there for him, and Abby was happy to be that person for him. Abby, Harvey whispered, I'm really sorry I ruined your wedding. That's quite all right. All is forgiven. She leaned her head back against the wall and soon fell asleep. Chapter 17. Jed had chosen the fastest mount he could find in the barn, but he knew none of them compared to Thunderbolt. He saddled the young bay as fast as he could, and was grateful that his hands knew the process even when his brain wasn't working right. Jed couldn't stop thinking about Abby and what might happen to her. She had no business leaving alone after dark. He scanned the side of the road as he galloped into woodland, praying he wouldn't find her injured in a ditch or tree line. Thunderbolt was a good horse, but any mount could be startled in the low light. He trotted through town, keeping his eyes open for Abby coming back toward home or any sign of trouble. Jed wasn't sure what to expect out of all of this. He just wanted to get his wife back. Arriving at the sheriff's office, he was relieved to find Thunderbolt tied outside. It meant that Abby had made the trip safely. He could go in, tell her that this was no place for a woman, and take her back home. With a little bit of luck, they would be safely on the Rusher farm before midnight. She might not let him in the house, but at least he would know where she was. The front door was unlocked, and he let himself in. Jed recognized Deputy Gaines at the desk, nearly snoozing over the paperwork in front of him. Jed, he said quietly, I should have known you would be coming along soon. Why are you whispering? Jed asked, keeping his voice low to match the lawman's. Last I checked, nobody was concerned with how well the prisoners slept. Gaines grinned, his teeth showing under his great flaming mustache. I don't, but they aren't the only ones sleeping. He stood from his desk and crooked a finger at Jed, bidding him to follow as he headed toward the cells in the back. The deputy paused in the doorway and pointed at the end of the hall, where Abby was sound asleep on a bench. Jed looked at his wife in astonishment. What's she doing? The big man led Jed back to his desk and waved at the chair in front of it. She said she wanted to speak with Harvey. I didn't think much of it, but they had quite the heart back there. Apparently, the man's all torn up about the death of his brother. In just a few words, that little wife of yours made him see the error of his ways. It's a shame it didn't happen sooner. His look turned grim at the thought of the judge's imminent arrival. About that, Jed began. He didn't owe Harvey any favors, but he owed a mountain of them to his wife. Is there any way we could make arrangements for him? I'd be happy to supply the sheriff's office with some extra meat or bushels of corn over the winter. I don't know, Gaines hesitated. Jed leaned forward. I only ask because I feel that this is all my fault. Everyone wanted me to do something about Harvey, but I resisted because I thought it would spare Abby's feelings. I was wrong, and the sheriff got hurt. I propose you release Harvey and send him back east. I'll pay for an escort for him all the way home if needed. The deputy leaned back in his chair. Raising the two front legs off the floor, he steepled his fingers in front of him as he thought, well, that might work out just fine. The sheriff himself said that you were the only person who could change his mind on pressing charges. He's injured, but he's going to make it. He let his chair thump back to the floor, then checked over his shoulder to see if he had awakened Abby. It's not the kind of thing we normally do, but for you, Jed, consider it done. Chapter 18. Abby was curled up on the bench, rubbing her hands over her arms even in her sleep. Her eyelids fluttered, but she was too tired to wake up yet. Staying on the bench to be near Harvey had been the longest night of her life. The bench was cold and hard, and tears leaked continuously out of the corners of her eyes. She had drifted in and out, and what sleep she had gotten was filled with terrible dreams. Finally relenting to the shaft of morning sunlight that was leaking in through the barred windows, Abby opened her eyes. She blinked to clear them and tried to sit up straight. Her neck and shoulders ached fiercely, and her entire body was stiff. She would stay with Harvey as long as she could, and then it was going to be a very long ride home. Abby wasn't looking forward to what Jed would have to say to her. Looking over at the cell next to her, Abby froze. She had expected to see Harvey sleeping, or perhaps praying if he was awake. Instead, his cell was completely empty. The gray woolen blanket lay rumpled on the bunk, and the cell door was open. No, Abby whispered as she clasped a hand to her cheek. There were only two options. Either Harvey had escaped sometime during the night, or he had already been taken to the judge without waking her. She wasn't happy with either one. A warm arm slid around her, and Abby jumped. Turning around, she discovered that she was no longer the only one on the bench. Jed sat beside her, his chocolate eyes looking down into hers with sympathy. As much as she wanted to lean into the warmth and comfort of his body, to melt away the chill and pain of the night, there was something more important to take care of first. Jed, where's Harvey? Has the judge come? I was planning to go with him. He shouldn't be alone during his last hours. Tears streamed down her cheeks anew as she realized she might have missed out on the biggest reason she had come to the jailhouse. Jed was going to be angry with her for running off after her former brother-in-law, but she would just have to make it up to him later. She started to push herself up off the bench. Jed wrapped a strong arm around her waist and pulled her back down. Abby, hold on. Harvey's fine. I promise. Right now, you and I need to talk. Abby looked around the jail frantically. Her nerves were on fire as she tried to figure out what was going on. But where is he? Jed cleared his throat nervously. I made arrangements for him to go back east. I don't understand, Abby murmured. For the moment, she was willing to succumb to his strength and sit next to him on the bench, but she told herself it was only to keep warm. "I should have told you about Harvey when I first found out," Jed explained. "He's been in trouble a lot since you and I got married, and apparently everyone thought you might be the right person to talk to him. I didn't think it was fair that you should still be tied to Harvey when he only wanted you to be miserable. By keeping Harvey a secret, I thought I was protecting you. It turns out I was wrong." Abby nodded. What her husband said made sense. She would have come into town to help Harvey or anyone else that needed her, but she could understand why Jed had kept quiet. Sometimes people held things inside because they thought it was the right thing to do, and sometimes they did it because it was too scary to let them out. "I wasn't as open with you as I should have been either," she admitted. "If I had come to you earlier, the first night we got home even, and told you how I felt, then we could have worked on things together. I was so miserable at first, and I only made it worse by keeping it a secret. I thought it made me tough and strong, but it only made my anger boil away inside me. I'm sorry." Jed curled his arm around her more tightly, and he pressed his lips against her hairline. "I'm sorry, too. I admit that I thought a wife sounded nice because I would have hot meals and a clean home. In a way, maybe I did think of you as a servant, even though I did think of you as a servant, even though I didn't realize it at the time. But once I met you, I knew it was much more than that, sleeping in the barn. All this time with you has only confirmed that. I love you. Abby." Jed pulled her in close, pressing her into his chest. "I love you too." Abby allowed herself to sink into him, and she knew that she meant every word of that short sentence. If she didn't love him, she never would have stayed at the farm. And though she had been the one to relegate him to the barn, Abby wanted Jed to be beside her as much as possible. A thought suddenly occurred to her, and Abby pulled back so she could look at him again. The moment was urgent, but she never failed to notice how handsome he was. His hair was in disarray, and she guessed that he had been awake most of the night. The usual stubble on his chin had turned into the beginnings of a beard, and there were dark circles under his eyes. Even so, she wouldn't have wanted to be married to anyone else. "But where is Harvey? I don't understand." Jed tipped his head back to rest it against the wall as he recited the details. Harvey needed a change of scenery, not a prison sentence or a hanging. "I'm good friends with both the sheriff and Deputy Gaines, and he agreed to let me make arrangements for Harvey to go back east. I had to promise some of the crops and pay for the escort to make it happen. It took everything I had saved up." He looked down at the floor in disgrace. "I know you and the boys had talked about fixing some things around the farm, like changing out the fence or building a new roof, but I just don't have the money." Abby stared at him for a moment, unable to find the right words. How could he apologize for doing something so generous and selfless? "Oh, Jed," she breathed, "I can't believe this." "I know. I should have talked to you about that first as well and let you help make the decision as to what to do with Harvey if it was going to leave us destitute. I wonder if I'm ever going to learn my lesson." Jed kept his arm around his wife, but his gaze remained focused on the ground. Abby leaned toward him and wrapped her arms around his neck. She pressed her lips to each of his cheeks, his forehead, his bristly chin, and finally his lips. She had spent so much time thinking that Jed was nothing but a mean, selfish brute, and now she finally knew the truth about him. Abby never could have expected this to turn out so well after such a rough beginning. Jed raised his eyebrows in surprise, but he quickly caught on and kissed her back. There was passion and warmth in his lips, and Abby felt the chill finally leaving her bones. "So you forgive me?" he asked with a shy smile. Abby laughed. "Only if you forgive me. And don't worry about the money. I have quite a bit from my work at the inn. According to John, it's more than enough to fix the fence and the roof." His eyebrows lowered dubiously. "I don't want you to have to spend all your money on the farm, Abby. I want you to do whatever makes you happy." She put a finger to her lip and rolled her eyes toward the ceiling. "Let's see. A beautiful home on a hilltop where I get to live with my wonderful husband and all of his smart, funny, helpful brothers. Yes, I'm pretty sure that's what will make me happy." He kissed her again. "I forgot to tell you one thing." "Yes?" "Before Harvey left, he asked me to tell you that he was sorry. He hopes that you'll forgive him someday, and he said that he'll write to you as soon as he gets settled in." Jed lifted one corner of his mouth as he recalled the conversation. "He said he would only do that if it was all right with me. But I told him it was. I think you're a good influence on him, Abby." When he left here, he wasn't the same man. The warmth in Abby's chest continued to bloom. She had her husband back, and Harvey was going to get another shot at life. She felt whole again, tired but whole. "Jed, there's only one more thing I want." "Anything for you, Abby." She tipped her head to rest it on his shoulder. "I want to go home." The couple bid goodbye to the deputy and headed out the door. They found their horses waiting patiently at the hitching post, and Jed insisted that Abby ride Thunderbolt home. Chapter 19. 2 months later, a thick blanket of snow had settled over the Rusher farm. The boys were kept busy with shoveling paths to the barn, chopping firewood, and breaking the ice on the water troughs. By the time they stumbled into the house for supper, their fingers were nearly frozen through, and their feet were numb from the cold. Abby bustled in the kitchen, filling mugs with hot cider or cocoa for them to sip until their meal was ready. It warmed their hands and their tongues, and they spoke quietly around the fireplace. She listened to the susurrus and smiled, knowing that she was surrounded by family. Yes, the farm was hard work, but it wasn't so bad when they all worked together. Even Boomer did his part, which usually consisted of laying on Abby's feet in the evenings to keep them warm. A second letter from Harvey had arrived earlier that day. He had returned to South Carolina, where he still had some family and was quickly able to find a place to stay. Her former brother-in-law hadn't touched a drop of liquor since he'd left California, and had even found himself a job at the general store. It turned out that Harvey was quite good at keeping track of inventory and ringing up sales, and he enjoyed getting to meet all sorts of people during the course of the day. Harvey asked Abby in his letter to apologize to Monroe for ever being rude to him. Jed was the last one in from his chores. He no longer waited in the living room with the rest of his brothers, but came into the kitchen to see if his wife needed any help. He came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist as she stirred a big pot of stew on the stove. "Bar, your arms are freezing," she exclaimed. "Here, have some cider." He took the proffered mug with a grin. "I thought I had a wife for that." Abby slapped him on the arm with a towel before returning to her cooking. "Oh, you! If you're going to be such trouble, then you can take that plate of biscuits and crock of butter out to the table." Jed did as he was told, setting down the mug of cider so he could carry the load. Sure, just put me to work. That's the only thing I'm good for," he jested. "If you're good," Abby said, making him pause at the door, "I have a surprise for you after supper." She smiled again, and her cheeks were beginning to hurt from the effort. She hadn't been able to keep a straight face all day. "I hope it isn't a surprise like I got last week when you told me the roof on the chicken coop had collapsed. I mean, I'm sure that the chickens don't mind taking up one of the stalls in the barn until we can build a new coop, but I have enough work as it is." Abby smiled. The coop had been an unpleasant surprise, indeed, and there were any number of things to watch out for during the winter. 2 weeks ago, an icy branch had collapsed onto the roof of the house. Fortunately, John's work had held fast and strong, and the branch merely tumbled to the ground. They would be lucky if that was a sign as to how the rest of the season would go. "No, nothing like that," she promised. "I can't wait." Jed pretended that he didn't mind waiting for Abby's surprise, but that wasn't quite true. He plowed through his meal, shoveling down his stew as quickly as he could, and hoping that his brothers would do the same. The faster they got through the meal, the sooner he would have some time alone with his wife. He had a surprise for her as well, and it burned inside him. They still had 2 weeks until Christmas, but he wasn't willing to wait. He touched the pocket of his trousers, making sure the treasure was still inside. It was small, yes, but he knew she would like it. "Jed, you must have worked up quite an appetite," Abby admonished from across the table as he picked up his bowl to drink the gravy. "You can't really blame him," Jeremiah said. He had gobbled his food just as quickly and was reaching for the pot at the center of the table for a second helping. "This is delicious." "That's only because it's hot," Abby countered. "After spending the day out there in the cold, I think you boys would eat dirt if I just warmed it up properly." "No way," Jeremiah replied. "This is far from dirt." His wife beamed across the table as she watched the boys eat, and Jed noticed a certain glow about her. Her happiness made him happy, and he knew that this Christmas would be the best one he'd ever had. Just having such a beautiful, loving wife at his side was the only gift he would ever need. Still, he wondered what she had for him. Jed offered to help clear the table himself to make the work go faster. The boys were good helpers, but they could often be found talking or goofing off as they assisted their sister-in-law. Jed would gladly put on an apron and wash the dishes himself if it meant it would make things go faster. But Abby shooed him out of the kitchen. "Join us for a game of cards," Josiah asked as he and the rest of the boys pushed in their chairs. Sunset came early now that it was winter, and they had completed all of their chores before supper. That meant that the rest of the evening was available for leisure. Jed shook his head. "No, thanks." "Actually, do you think you could take your game upstairs? I need to have a word with Abby once she's done." Josiah glanced at the kitchen door and grinned. "No problem. Come on, boys." The brothers tromped noisily up the stairs and disappeared into their bedrooms. Left alone, Jed paced in front of the fireplace. He touched his pocket again, hoping Abby would like his gift. Should he wait until Christmas so she had something to open by the tree? No. He knew she would need it now. And what did she have for him? He wasn't aware of his wife making a trip to town any time recently, so it must have been something she had made. He could hear the clanking of the dishes and finally sat down to wait. "I hope I didn't keep you too long," Abby said when she finally emerged from the kitchen and wiped her hands on her apron. Loose strands of hair had worked free from her braid and framed her face delicately. She collapsed into the chair next to him and smiled. "I would wait forever for you," he replied honestly. Abby blushed. "You're too sweet." "I won't wait, though," he said. For the surprises, He stood up from his chair and reached a hand into his pocket. "It just so happens that I have something for you as well." He produced a small wooden case. He'd asked Josiah to carve it, being so good with his hands, and then John had attached a small cord so that it would tie around her waist. Abby fingered the smooth wood with a smile. "What is it?" "I know how you're always losing your glasses, so this will keep them with you at all times. You'll never need to look for them when you want to sew or read your Bible." "Thank you." "That's so kind of you." She planted a kiss on his cheek before studying the gift some more. Suddenly, she began laughing. "I guess this means I'll need to find my glasses so I can put them in here." Jed laughed along with her, but he couldn't wait any longer. "Okay, I'm ready. What do you have for me?" He expected her to pull out something she had embroidered or sewn, perhaps a new shirt. Instead, she took his hand and pressed it to her lower stomach. "We're going to have a baby, Jed." He stared in awe at the spot where his hand rested. Her abdomen seemed just as flat as always, but he swore he could feel a difference in it. Perhaps it was just in his head, but he couldn't believe this wonderful news. "You're sure?" She laughed again. "Very sure. Our little one will arrive sometime in the summer." Jed clasped his wife to his chest and squeezed her. Then he lessened his grip to keep from crushing her. "This was the best surprise you ever could have given me. I love you." "I love you too." "Boys," he roared, "you need to come down here, quick." Like thunder, 6 young men came barreling down the stairs. The house shook with their effort, and they stood in front of their brother with curious looks on their faces. "I have something to tell you, boys, and it's very important." Jed did his best to keep a grave, straight face, but it was difficult under the circumstances. "It's serious, and you'll need to take it seriously. Do you think you can do that?" They nodded, dumbfounded and confused. Abby grinned at them. "Boys, you're all going to be uncles." The shouts, cheers, and whoops of laughter were so loud Jed thought Dale down the road could probably hear them. His brothers gathered around, hugging Abby, slapping Jed, and dancing in front of the fireplace. Jed couldn't remember ever feeling so content in his entire life, and he pulled Abby closer. Their big family just kept growing. The end. Thank you for listening. Here at Pure Read, we aim to serve you, our dear readers and listeners, with good, clean Christian stories. You can be assured that any Pure Read book you pick up will not only be hugely enjoyable, but free of any objectionable content. We are deeply thankful to you for choosing our books. Your support means that we can continue to provide stories like the one you have just listened to. To browse our range of clean and wholesome titles, go to pureread.com. Please like and subscribe to our channel. That way you'll be the first to hear when new stories arrive here for your enjoyment. God bless you, and thank you again for listening.